In a glittering, ostentatious world where the wealthy reign supreme, appearances often mask a darker reality. Jane, a young woman of unassuming origins, finds herself thrust into this world when she marries into a family swimming in riches. But this newfound life is a gilded cage, brimming with secrets and treacherous falsehoods. In a mansion where trust is a forgotten virtue, love becomes a dangerous game, and betrayal lurks around every corner. But what happens when hate begins to masquerade as affection? Who will be the first to succumb to the intoxicating allure of the charade? In this high-stakes drama, every decision carries a perilous weight, and emotions surge like a raging tempest. As long-buried truths begin to surface, alliances crumble, and clandestine secrets are dragged into the light. When the dust settles and the facade crumbles, who will emerge unscathed? This is a story of profound lessons, a stark warning about the corrosive nature of greed, a celebration of the indomitable strength of a woman pushed to her limits, a testament to love's transformative power, and a grim reminder that betrayal always demands a steep price. Prepare to be swept away by a narrative brimming with unexpected twists and turns, where nothing is as it seems and every moment presents a new, daunting challenge. This is more than just a story. It's a thrilling adventure that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Jane felt the brutal sting of heavy slaps against her face, the sharp report echoing in the opulent room. "What have I done wrong?" she cried out, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and indignation. Her father, a man whose face was now contorted with rage, thundered, "How dare you question my decision about whom you will marry? What have you ever contributed to this family?" His eyes were like chips of ice, his anger radiating like a palpable heat. This wasn't the first time Jane had endured such violence for simply voicing a question born of desperation. She had dared to ask why she was being forced into a loveless marriage, a union she had no desire for. "Your little sister would be overjoyed to have such an opportunity, but the Johns specifically requested you, not Miriam." Her father spat, his teeth clenched tight. "You should be grateful. You're hardly qualified to marry into a family of their stature." Jane, emboldened by a flicker of defiance, retorted, "Is that so? I'm not qualified, yet they asked for me. Who are you trying to deceive? Can't you see I'm not a child anymore? It's only natural they would want to protect Miriam." She was the family princess, carefully shielded from the harsh realities of their existence, while Jane was nothing more than a second-rate option, a fallback considered only in the absence of anything better. "If you refuse to marry Mr. John, I will make this house a living hell for you, and you will have no choice but to leave in disgrace," her father threatened, his voice dripping with venom. Jane, her chin held high, shot back. What disgrace could be greater than being forced to marry a man who is practically a vegetable? He raised his hand once more, ready to strike, but the door flew open, and Jane's stepmother glided in, her face adorned with her signature, saccharine smile. She grasped his arm with practiced grace, feigning concern. "Dear husband, must you resort to violence? I thought we had discussed this." Jane felt a wave of nausea wash over her at the charade. Her stepmother's words were hollow, incapable of swaying even the most naive observer. This woman, her own mother's half-sister, had spun a web of lies that led to her mother being driven from their home. But banishing her mother hadn't quenched her thirst for control. Now, she wanted Jane gone too. Her stepmother turned to Jane, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Jane, I know you want what's best for this family." Jane flinched as her stepmother's hand patted her softly on the back. "Mr. John is our ticket to permanent freedom from poverty. Don't you want us to live a normal life like we did before?" Jane felt a surge of fury. She was being bartered, traded for their happiness, and she was powerless to stop it. "If you both cared about me even a little, you wouldn't be forcing me to marry a man I don't love, all for the sake of money. You better shut your mouth before I shut it for you," her father snarled, his face darkening with renewed rage. Jane ignored him, fixing her gaze on her stepmother. "If you're so desperate to be associated with Mr. John's family, why don't you offer up your precious daughter Miriam? Jane would have been extremely happy to marry the young master if he were whole, but he wasn't. After completing his studies abroad, a reckless driver had allegedly crashed into him some time ago. The accident was said to have left him in a vegetative state. Since then, rumors had it that he didn't have much time to live. I don't want you to continue your fruitless job search, scraping by as you have been since you graduated college. Marrying Mr. John will leave you wanting for nothing, her stepmother added, her smile as thin and brittle as ice. Jane gritted her teeth, her anger simmering beneath the surface. She could run away, disappear into the city's anonymity, but her younger brother was still in the hospital, his medical bills mounting, a constant weight on her conscience. Knowing she was trapped, with no immediate escape, she reluctantly conceded to her father and stepmother's demands. Their threats were becoming increasingly menacing, and her brother's health was deteriorating with each passing day. Days bled into one another, and soon, the wedding day arrived, a somber event shrouded in an atmosphere of forced celebration. At the ceremony, Jane didn't even catch a glimpse of her supposed husband. She went through the motions, reciting the vows, exchanging rings, and with a profound sense of foreboding, signed the marriage certificate, binding herself to a stranger, a man neither truly alive nor truly dead. The drive to the John family mansion was surreal. The imposing estate was perched atop a hill on the city's outskirts, a place reserved for the privileged elite. Abruptly, the car came to a halt, and a servant appeared, his face impassive. "Madam, please follow me." The servant led Jane through the grand entrance hall and up a sweeping staircase to a room that dwarfed any she had ever seen. The room was dimly lit, casting long, dancing shadows across the opulent furnishings. On the massive bed in the master bedroom lay her supposed husband, Mr. John. He possessed striking features, a straight, aristocratic nose, sharply defined eyebrows, and a face that, even in repose, radiated an undeniable magnetism. He looked like someone who would be difficult to get along with. He was no doubt a well-known man even though he appeared lifeless, but his aura was oppressive, and Jane feared he would be quite dangerous if he wasn't in a coma. A pang of pity pierced her heart at the thought that he was fading away, robbed of the chance to experience a full and vibrant life. Hesitantly, Jane reached out, her fingers tracing the contours of his brow, gliding across his cheekbones, and finally settling on his parched lips. Even in his unconscious state, he exuded a captivating allure, and she found herself secretly wishing he would awaken, if only for a moment on their wedding night. Suddenly, she felt a stir beneath her fingertips, a faint tremor that sent a jolt of electricity through her. She snatched her hand away as if burned, leaping back in shock and clutching at the nearby window blind for support. "I thought they said he's in a coma. Why is he suddenly wide awake?" Panic surged through her as she watched her supposed husband on the bed. Although his eyes were wide open, his expression remained as cold and distant as it had been when he was supposedly comatose. Just then, a knock echoed at the door, and Jane rushed to answer it, desperate for another presence in the room, someone to break the suffocating tension. "I think Mr. John is awake. He has opened his eyes," she blurted out to the young maid standing in the hallway. The maid regarded Jane with a disdainful look before replying, "You shouldn't be playing around here. This isn't some amusement park for children." "But I wasn't playing around. I saw him open his eyes just before you knocked. Take care of the young master and stop being so jumpy," the maid retorted dismissively. She turned to leave, but Jane grabbed her arm, her voice laced with desperation. "Please, can I have another room to sleep in? I don't think I can sleep in here. If you want Mr. John's family to demand their money back, you can go ahead," the maid snapped. What money is she talking about? Jane wondered, her heart sinking. The maid saw the confusion etched on Jane's face and eyed her sternly. "I guess you're not aware that your family sold you to the young master for a very hefty sum. Like I said, you are no different from a maid in this house. The only difference is that you're here for Mr. John's needs." Jane's eyes welled up with tears. She knew her parents were capable of callousness, but she had never imagined they would sink so low as to sell her like chattel. That night, Jane resolved to find happiness, to carve out a life for herself, regardless of the obstacles that lay ahead. After washing up, she lay down beside her unconscious husband, but sleep eluded her. She had always envisioned her wedding night as a magical, unforgettable experience, but here she was, sharing a bed with a lifeless man who might never even know she existed, who might never see her face before he succumbed to his illness. She tossed and turned in frustration, wondering why sleep refused to claim her. Finally, exhaustion won, and she drifted into a restless slumber, only to find herself plunged into a series of bizarre, unsettling dreams. When Jane awoke, her body ached, every muscle protesting from the night's turmoil. A loud knock reverberated at the door. The woman standing there was older than the maid from the previous night, and she exuded an air of icy composure. She fixed Jane with an impatient glare. "Are you still sleeping at this hour?" she demanded. I didn't realize I was supposed to wake up earlier," Jane stammered, caught off guard. "Hurry up. The rest of the family is waiting downstairs to be served breakfast." Jane felt another wave of shock wash over her. The maid had said she was only contracted for Mr. John's needs alone. Why were they now expecting her to serve them? She quickly smoothed her hair and adjusted her nightdress, steeling herself for the ordeal ahead. Downstairs, her eyes were drawn to the faces of Mr. John's family members. They were all seated around the long dining table, and their gazes snapped towards the staircase as they heard her footsteps. The older maid, showing a rare flicker of kindness, had already prepared the tea. Jane only needed to serve it. She walked carefully towards the table and offered a polite greeting, making sure to avoid eye contact. They drank their tea in silence, only looking at her when she asked for permission to leave. "You're now part of the family and should be here with us," a man said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of Mr. John's father. He looked remarkably like his son, only older and with a network of fine lines etched around his eyes. After speaking, he gestured to an empty seat directly opposite his own. Jane offered a weak smile and sat down quietly, careful not to offend the others, who continued to glare at her as if she were some unwelcome interloper. "Jane, I want you to always be by Johnson's side. I would appreciate it if you took good care of him." Jane nodded in response, her heart pounding in her chest. His smile was disarming, capable of melting even the most hardened of hearts. He set down his teacup and added, "I will make sure that nobody treats you unfairly. When Johnson wakes up, you both should be ready to give me a grandson." "What is he saying? Didn't they say that he only has a few months to live? When will he wake up to have a child with her? Why does he seem so confident about his recovery?" After breakfast, Jane was led back to the master bedroom by Mrs. Joan. "You will have to rest now. I need to tidy up the house, and I will be back to give you instructions on what to do." Jane heaved a sigh of relief as Mrs. Joan closed the door behind her. As she turned to lie on the bed, she suddenly heard a faint whimpering sound. She spun around and saw Mr. John lift his hand slightly. Terrified, Jane fled from the room, nearly colliding with Mrs. Joan, who was approaching. "Madam, where are you going? You were supposed to stay here until I returned. I think Mr. John is awake." "He moved his hand just now," Jane stammered, staring at her expectantly. The woman ignored Jane and went to the bed to examine the person sleeping on the bed. Jane watched as she scoffed at how much nuisance she was causing already without knowing. "Here's Mr. John's to-do list," she said, handing a file to Jane. Jane obediently took the file and blinked at the sheer volume of tasks a bedridden, unconscious man supposedly required. The first item on the list was to wash him and change his clothes first thing in the morning. Each duty was meticulously arranged in order of performance. "Am I supposed to bathe him by myself?" Jane asked timidly, unsure of the response she would receive, hoping against hope that the answer would be no. "Of course, it's one of your duties as his wife." The truth was, Jane had never seen a naked man's body before, and her cheeks flushed at the thought of seeing Mr. John's. Although he was sick, Mr. John had a breathtaking figure. Jane could tell he was handsome the night she arrived and mistakenly leaned into him while checking if he was truly unconscious. He's indeed handsome. It's a pity she would be able to see and touch him, but he wouldn't be able to do the same, she thought to herself, somehow feeling ashamed at the direction her supposedly innocent mind was heading. Jane was filled with anxiety as she prepared to bathe her unconscious husband. Mr. John lay motionless in the water, the only ripples caused by her gentle motions as she washed his body. She marveled at how cold his skin felt beneath her palm. Suddenly, his hand twitched, and she stared at him in shock. "If you're going to wake up, why don't you just do it?" she muttered. With the help of the male servants, Jane managed to get Mr. John back into bed. Exhausted from the effort, she lay down beside him, her body aching from the strain. "If you're lucky enough to survive this, you will surely reward me for all this stress," she threatened lightly. Just as she began to drift off, a knock on the door interrupted her. "Madam, the boss's mother wants to see you," a voice called out. Jane frowned. The timing couldn't have been worse. Despite her eagerness to meet her mother-in-law, she wished it wasn't now. In the sitting room downstairs, her mother-in-law scrutinized her as she walked in, her eyes filled with thinly veiled disdain. "Are you Jane? I hope you know why you're here," the woman asked, leaving no room for misinterpretation and unsure of how to respond without offending her. Jane nodded affirmatively. Her mother-in-law's words were harsh, reminding Jane that her family had sold her to them and that she was to be treated as they pleased. If she ever got tired of the marriage, "My son is unwell, but that doesn't mean he is dead. If I hear any rumor about you misbehaving with other men, I will make sure you are punished severely," she threatened. "Why would you say that? I am still here, you know." Her husband's voice interrupted, slicing through the tension like a knife. They both turned to see Mr. John's father glaring at his wife. She quickly backpedaled, claiming she was only teaching Jane how to be a proper wife. Jane chimed in, adding that Mrs. E was instructing her on taking care of Mr. John, hoping to diffuse the situation. Mr. E softened, reassuring Jane. "Don't mind her strictness. I can see you are well trained, and I know our son is in good hands." Grateful for his kindness, Jane excused herself and returned to her room. As she approached, she heard a voice inside, someone speaking in hushed tones. "Brother, I have always admired you, but right now you're as good as dead. I don't know why they married a wife for you. What need does a dead man have for a wife?" Jane's fist clenched in anger. She pushed open the door to find a stranger choking Mr. John. "What are you doing?" she shouted, pushing the man away. The stranger released his grip and adjusted his clothes, glaring at her. "Who are you, and how did you get into this room?" Jane demanded. Ignoring her questions, the man introduced himself as Kennedy, Mr. John's younger brother. Jane, suspicious of his intentions, warned him not to enter the room without permission again. Kennedy smirked and approached her, his eyes gleaming with malice. "I know how lonely you must be with my brother lying hopelessly here. Why don't you come to me tonight for some fun?" Jane recoiled in disgust. "You're insane if you think I would want anything to do with you," she spat back. Kennedy's smile vanished, and he grabbed her arm roughly, his grip tightening. "I've always wanted everything that belongs to my brother, including his women," he said coldly. Jane struggled, kicking him in the crotch. Enraged, Kennedy shoved her hard, causing her to stumble backward and hit her head against the corner of the bedside table. In pain, Jane's hand instinctively reached for her throbbing head. Kennedy, showing no remorse, laughed cynically at her clumsiness, but a surge of strength welled up within her. She lunged at him, her eyes blazing with fury. "You fool!" she hissed. "Don't you ever dare lay a hand on me again." A strange sound from Mr. John's bed halted their struggle. Both froze, turning to see Mr. John awakening, his eyes flickering in the dim light. Kennedy panicked and fled the room. Jane, now by Mr. John's bedside, gently touched a faint scratch on his head. To her astonishment, he grabbed her hand with a firm grip. "Who are you, and what are you doing in my room?" Mr. John demanded with stern authority. I am your wife, Jane," she stammered, bewildered by his sudden consciousness. Mr. John released her hand, and she bolted from the room, gasping for breath. He has finally woken up, she screamed, alerting the household. Excitement rippled through the house as everyone gathered to see Mr. John awake. Everyone except for Kennedy, who struggled to paste a smile on his face. In the sitting room, Mr. E and Mrs. E chatted happily with their son. Mr. John's gaze lingered on Jane, making her increasingly uneasy. The family doctor arrived to examine him. I'm truly shocked at his sudden recovery. He's totally fine and would benefit from rehabilitation treatment. As the family celebrated, Kennedy attempted to slip away, citing an important meeting. Mr. E was not pleased. After all these years, your brother has just awakened, and you now wish to leave? Kennedy stammered, explaining that foreign partners were due to arrive. He approached Mr. John, forcing a sheepish smile. It's good to have you back, bro. Mr. John's gaze swept over everyone before resting on Jane. Who is she? And why is she here? Mrs. E motioned for Jane to come closer, introducing her as Mr. John's wife. Jane felt even more uncomfortable under his cold scrutiny. Later, alone in their room, Mr. John's stern voice cut through the silence. You do not have any business here, so get out. Jane retreated, her heart pounding. She nearly bumped into Mrs. Joan, who understood Mr. John's temper. That night, Jane found solace in Mrs. Joan's room, enjoying her most peaceful sleep since arriving at the E's family mansion. The next morning, a maid rudely awakened Jane, informing her that Mr. John had requested his breakfast. Jane followed her to the kitchen, where she was handed Mr. John's food menu. She served him, but his disdainful look was evident. What exactly are you good at? You can't even make ordinary beef noodles, he sneered, slamming the half-eaten dish on the table. Jane, startled and humiliated, retreated to her room in tears. In the afternoon, Mr. John returned from a checkup. From afar, Jane heard shouts demanding her presence. Mr. John barged into her room, furious. I want my room cleaned up right now, he ordered. Jane was shocked at the state of the room. It was filthy, a stark contrast to its previous neatness. Mr. John's strange smile suggested he was testing her patience. Jane remained calm and started cleaning, determined to avoid further conflict. As Jane settled into her new routine, she moved into the maid's quarters, finding relief from no longer having to care for Mr. John directly. One morning, a servant informed her that Mr. John had requested his breakfast. Jane prepared the meal, aware of his scrutiny. Are you planning to make me serve myself? He sneered as she approached the table. Jane dished out the food and backed away. Despite his initial disdain, he acknowledged her cooking skills with a grudging compliment. However, he quickly reverted to his harsh demeanor. After breakfast, Mr. E praised Jane, hoping she and Mr. John would give him a grandson soon. Mr. John, unimpressed, dismissed the idea, questioning Jane's suitability. Jane's heart pounded as Mr. John vented his anger. Do you think someone like you can be my wife? You can forget about what my father said. It will never happen. He ordered her to move out of his room, making her his personal maid instead. Jane felt relieved to have her own space, even in the maid's quarters. As Jane continued her duties, she grew accustomed to Mr. John's temper. Despite the challenges, she found strength in her resilience, determined to make the best of her situation. Jane scanned the ruin caused by her supposed husband and boss. She wouldn't dare address him as her husband anymore, not since he woke up from his slumber. John could kill anyone who dares to address her as his wife, not that she was bothered. She was better off single than staying married to a man as mean as John. But she couldn't ask for a divorce either, except John asked for it himself. She hoped and prayed that he would someday get tired of seeing her and maybe finally ask for the divorce. Jane cursed silently as she cleaned up the mess. He's intentionally doing all of this to piss me off, she thought to herself. Satisfied with her work, she took a fake bow before strutting out of the room into the kitchen. She knew John would be demanding his lunch soon, and she didn't want his usual tantrums. Suddenly, She heard the sound of approaching footsteps and straightened herself to face whatever was coming her way. Ken stood at the door, his face beaming with smiles. "I have missed staring at your beautiful face," he said, taking in her stressed outlook. "Has my brother become too demanding again?" Jane stiffened. "I don't remember sending for you, brother-in-law." She stressed the words. Ken sneered. "Considering what almost took place between us the last time, I believe you should have a more suitable name for me." "And what exactly could that possibly be?" Jane retorted. Jan walked into the kitchen, gritting his teeth, his fists clenched, triggering fear in both Ken and Jane. Ken forced a smile and stretched out his hand for a handshake. "Welcome, brother. Actually, it was nothing. I was only trying to cheer up sister-in-law in your absence." Jan ignored the outstretched hand and sneered at Jane, who pretended to be busy with the cutlery on the table. The air in the kitchen became humid despite the heater being on since 3 a.m. "I don't think Jane needs to be cheered up. She has a lot of work to keep her busy," Jan said, throwing a fierce gaze at Ken without uttering another word. Ken fled from the kitchen, leaving Jane alone to face John's scorn. "Stay away from my brother. I won't say this again." John pointed at Ken's exiting figure. Later that day, Jane decided to pay a visit to her sick brother at the hospital. Jane fought back tears as the doctor ran a check on her younger brother, Jade. It was the second time she was visiting him in the hospital since she moved into John's mansion. Contrary to what the stepmother reassured her, "Jade's treatment is still pending payment, Miss Ferdinand. We need to proceed with the surgeries as soon as possible. The cancer is aggressively consuming him." The doctor, having delivered the grim prognosis, departed. Jane, her heart pounding, rushed to Jade's side, perched on the sterile hospital bed. He was a mere shadow of the vibrant boy he once was, his features gaunt and pale. "Sister, don't worry too much, okay? I'll be back home as soon as the surgery is done," Jade whispered, his voice weak and strained. Jane couldn't bear to burden him with the truth, that she was no longer at the family house, but trapped in a loveless marriage with a cruel man. She gently settled beside him, careful not to jostle his arm, which was heavily bandaged from a recent procedure. At the tender age of 10, he'd been diagnosed with a cancerous lump on his head, a cruel twist of fate that had brought him incessant pain. Her eyes narrowed as her thoughts drifted to her mother's struggling company, teetering on the brink of collapse. The time for decisive action had come, even if it meant relinquishing her share of the business, the last vestige of her former life. Meanwhile, John found himself wrestling with a disquieting obsession, the persistent urge to inflict pain on Jane. That morning, a sharp, inexplicable pang had pierced his chest when he'd witnessed her conversing with his brother in the kitchen. An involuntary smile crept across his face as he fantasized about the devastation his decision to divorce her would unleash. He was weary of enduring her presence, and despite his father's vehement opposition to the divorce, he was determined to proceed. He would present Jane with an offer so enticing, so irresistible, that she would be compelled to do his bidding. "Sir, she's not in the villa," the maid announced, her voice trembling with trepidation. John's gaze swept across the opulent sitting room before settling on the maid's quivering form. "And who authorized her to leave?" The timid maid opened her mouth to respond, but quickly clamped it shut, her eyes downcast in fear. "Tell her to see me immediately upon her return." The servant bowed deeply before scurrying away, desperate to escape John's oppressive presence. His chilling demeanor was enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. Jane felt his piercing gaze burning into her skin, an unwelcome invasion that sent a wave of discomfort washing over her. She had mentally braced herself for his usual barrage of insults and accusations as she stood frozen in place. Her eyes darted around the room until they landed on a stack of files lying neatly on the center table. Asterisk, could it be? Asterisk, she wondered. Asterisk, are those divorce papers? Has he finally agreed to set me free? "I want my car washed now," he commanded, his voice sharp and devoid of emotion. "But it's raining heavily," she stammered, gesturing towards the torrential downpour outside. "Is that supposed to be a problem?" Every servant in this house understands their duties, John retorted icily. Jane bit her lip, her anxiety mounting. She couldn't believe her so-called husband was demanding this of her, especially in such inclement weather. A deafening clap of thunder reverberated through the sitting room, accentuating the absurdity of the situation. She glanced at him quickly before hurrying out of the room to change into more practical attire. Despite the heavy rain, she prepared to wash the car. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Joan, the head housekeeper, entered, carrying a steaming plate of pepper soup. "Here's a plate of pepper soup for you," she said kindly. "I figured you haven't had anything to eat since you left the house this morning." Jane gratefully accepted the plate of soup, appreciating the warmth and comfort Mrs. Joan provided. Since Jane's arrival at the villa, Mrs. Joan had been a rare source of kindness, treating her with the care and affection of a mother, unlike the other maids who regarded her as an outsider, an interloper. "It's okay. You need to go wash the car now before the boss starts looking for you," Mrs. Joan hinted softly, disengaging from a brief hug. Through the sheer glass of the living room's sliding doors, John watched Jane step out into the rain, a cruel grin spreading across his face. He relished seeing her struggle against the elements. His sole aim to humiliate her to the point where she would abandon all hope and flee his house, thus saving him the inconvenience of a divorce that would undoubtedly displease his parents. Another thunderclap sent Jane scurrying for the nearest shed in the compound, seeking meager shelter from the relentless storm. She was well aware of John's deep-seated animosity towards her. The truth was she feared asking for a divorce. His family had paid a substantial sum for her hand in marriage, and although her ailing brother hadn't received a penny of it, she knew she would be held responsible for repaying every cent they had spent on her family before she could ever hope to regain her freedom. "I am a slave," she muttered, the words barely audible above the roar of the rain. "My own family sold me under the guise of marriage." Her tears mingled with the raindrops that streamed down her face, each drop a testament to her despair. After what felt like an eternity spent washing the car, she wiped the rain and tears from her face and retreated to her room, seeking solace in its confines. She changed into dry clothes and lay down, hoping to drift into a peaceful slumber, but her sleep was soon interrupted by an icy shiver that jolted her awake. Jane rubbed her eyes, struggling to shake off the lingering remnants of her nightmare. It was almost time for dinner, and she knew John wouldn't hesitate to punish her if she was late. She swayed back and forth, overwhelmed by exhaustion, until she stumbled against a rigid figure. Jane looked up to see John glaring down at her, his eyes filled with a cold fury. "What took you so long?" he demanded, his voice laced with impatience. I was just," she stammered, searching for a plausible excuse. "Enough with the excuses. Prepare dinner now," he ordered curtly. Jane nodded submissively and hurried towards the kitchen, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't continue living like this, trapped in this endless cycle of servitude and abuse, but she felt powerless, devoid of any viable options. John entered the kitchen, his eyes blazing with rage. "Have you suddenly become too clumsy to see what's in front of you?" he mocked, shoving Jane roughly out of his way. She staggered backward, struggling to regain her balance. "I'm sorry, sir," Jane began, but he cut her off dismissively before she could finish. "You can save your excuses for someone who has a need for them," John snapped, his voice dripping with contempt. Jane turned and fled towards the kitchen, suddenly overwhelmed by a wave of nausea that churned in her stomach. Her mind flashed back to the events of earlier that day, when she had been forced to wash John's car in the torrential rain. The sudden change in her body could be a result of that exposure to the elements. Ignoring the feeling, she pressed on with the preparations for dinner, determined to remain strong for her brother's sake. But her legs suddenly felt weak and unsteady, and before she knew it, she was lying face down on the cold kitchen floor. John couldn't understand Jane's recent bout of clumsiness. She was constantly bumping into things or tripping over her own feet at every opportunity. Lifting her off the floor was certainly not part of his plan. He had vowed never to have any physical contact with her, still haunted by the memory of sharing a bed with her while he was unconscious. However, as he gazed at her fragile form lying sprawled on the floor, a sudden, inexplicable urge to protect her washed over him. Her disheveled hair framed her face, and a gentle breeze revealed a slight cut on her forehead. She must be really delicate to have sustained an injury just by tripping, he concluded, before gently lifting her and carrying her to her bed. What happened to her? John heard a familiar voice ask from the doorway. Dad, I didn't know you were back already, he exclaimed, attempting to sound happy as his father pushed the door open and entered the room. Well, you would have known if you had bothered to answer your phone, his dad hinted, a touch of annoyance in his tired voice. What happened to her? He asked again, moving closer to the bed for a better look at Jane. John hesitated, grappling with the impulse to lie. He had never been one to deceive his father, but right now it seemed like the only viable option. Jane had gradually wormed her way into his father's affections, earning his care and concern more than anyone else in the family. If his dad learned of the events that had transpired in his absence, he would undoubtedly be furious with John. I don't know. I found her on the floor just a few minutes ago, he admitted coldly, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Jane's eyes fluttered open, and shock registered on her pale face. Is that how much you missed me while I was away, Dad? She asked softly as his free hand casually brushed a strand of hair from her face. John felt something twist inside him as a broad grin appeared on her face. He couldn't explain the open display of affection between the two of them. If he didn't know better, he would have believed that his father harbored feelings for her. Dad noticed the way Jane recoiled in pain and asked if she was okay. She forced a smile. I think I just slipped while climbing the stairs, Jane responded. Dad frowned before casting John a weary glance. I suppose you would have done better by calling the family doctor. What if she's in danger? She could be in danger for all I care, John thought bitterly. I couldn't care less if she was hurt. I just want her out of this house and onto the streets where she belongs. I'm okay, sir. Don't bother, Jane quickly interjected, shocking John with her smooth yet obvious lie. She was definitely a skilled liar, and he hoped his dad would eventually see her for who she truly was. Jane tried to sit up to affirm her statement, but her whole body felt weak, and even the fake smile on her face couldn't conceal her discomfort. I'm calling the doctor immediately, Dad announced, reaching for his phone in his shirt pocket. Suddenly, the door opened, revealing Madame Joan and the family doctor. Have you felt nauseated in the past few days? The doctor asked while examining Jane's eyes. Yes, more often than necessary. I threw up countless times yesterday and even today, Jane admitted in a weak voice. Dad raised an eyebrow. Did you inform anyone about this? It was nothing serious. I didn't want to bother anyone, Jane replied. Dad opened his mouth to scold her, but was silenced by the doctor's next statement. She's pregnant. John was speechless. He knew he was supposed to be excited by the news, but if she was pregnant, it would only make it more difficult to get her out of the house, since he was absolutely certain that the pregnancy was not his doing. Doctor, don't you think you're being too hasty with the conclusion? You should run a test on her first, John said, throwing a cold glance at Jane. All this while, Dad seemed to have a smile plastered on his face. He wouldn't blame him. It had always been his wish to have a grandchild, except that this time, his joy was going to be short-lived. What are you saying, doctor? I have never. Jane quickly cut herself off, not before John noticed the tiny hint of embarrassment in her voice. There was no need for the pretense. Her type was always shameless, and he was determined to prove it to everyone once a proper checkup was conducted. Have you had your period this month? The doctor asked. Jane hesitated before shaking her head in response. I will take a sample of her blood for the test. Be rest assured that you will get the report tomorrow, he hinted as his hands closed around the syringe in his hand. Even though Jane's periods hadn't been regular, she had never considered it a major concern. The last doctor she visited had assured her it was normal for most women and encouraged her to rest more, as too much stress could be a contributing factor. Even though she was worried by the constant nausea, weakness, and vomiting, She couldn't bring herself to believe she was pregnant. Her so-called husband was yet to sleep with her. She quickly scolded herself for thinking along those lines. Nothing of the sort would ever happen between her and John. He had told her countless times that he would rather kill her than let her touch him. Aside from that, she hadn't had any prior intimacy with anyone before marrying into the East family. While she had looked forward to giving her virginity to her husband, John would never be that husband. What if she's pregnant? Jane thought, fear gripping her heart. Fred, her ex-boyfriend, was the only one who nearly had his way with her, but that was some years ago. The night Fred forced himself on her, he almost succeeded before the intervention of a stranger. Although she didn't remember the face of the stranger, he was well built like John and almost possessed the same aura. But she couldn't see his face. The room Fred pushed her into before the attack was rather tiny, and she could barely make out his face in the darkness. She only remembered his scent because of the way he scooped her into his arms like she weighed nothing. While a part of John prayed for the result to be positive, his mind seemed to betray him. The familiar smell that drifted off her body when he lifted her off the kitchen floor was still evident on his shirt. It was the same smell from that other night, the same night he had the accident that left him unconscious for years. Flashback. JN was seen driving towards a lonely road as he hummed to a popular tune on his car stereo. He took the next turn and realized he had forgotten to pick up his best friend Alan from his house. He was supposed to have dinner with them tonight. Suddenly, he spotted a hefty guy dragging a young girl into a nearby cabin while she screamed and called out for help. He would have ignored them as he was not the type to meddle in other people's affairs, but a part of him secretly wanted to help the poor girl. He quickly parked his car and followed the trail left by the big man's feet on the sticky ground. He scoffed at how badly the place looked and wondered how people survived in such a place. He peered through the open window and calculated his next action. The guy was huge too, and although John was an inch taller, he knew he wouldn't be easy to deal with. He waited until the guy pounced on the girl before bursting through the open door and hitting him with a table lamp within his reach. The girl was definitely a coward, he thought as he scooped her into his arms. There were many objects she could use on the man to leave him dazed and allow her the opportunity to escape, but she did nothing. I will definitely teach my daughter self-defense, he concluded as he drove the unconscious girl to the nearest hospital. It was while driving back home that a driver rammed into him, resulting in his being in a coma for years. While his parents believed he was rammed into by a drunk driver, he was certain it wasn't the case. Whoever rammed into him had it all planned out. Even though Jane was certain the test result would be negative, she still felt anxious. Her whole body ached badly, and she also had a mild fever. She had been struggling to get some sleep since the doctor declared her pregnant. Suddenly, she remembered an old technique her grandma always used on her whenever she had trouble sleeping. She would try it out, hoping to get some sleep afterward. She was almost dozing off when she heard the door open, and Madame Joan was standing beside her with a package in her hands. "I got you some pain relievers for the pains and fever," Madame Joan said kindly. Jane took the pill from her hand and was about to gulp it down with a glass of water when another wave of nausea hit her. "Are you okay?" Mrs. Joan asked, concern etched on her face. "It's nothing serious, just a little discomfort in my stomach," Jane replied. Mrs. Joan frowned. "Doesn't look so to me. Have you had your period this month?" "No, not yet," Jane responded. Mrs. Joan's face changed from a frown to a quick smile. "Madam, are you pregnant?" The water and the pill in Jane's mouth sprayed out on her body. Mrs. Joan quickly gasped in shock. "Like I said, it's nothing serious and I'm not pregnant. I'm only guessing. Besides, the symptoms you listed are relative to that of pregnancy," Mrs. Joan added solemnly. Jane quickly apologized for soiling her dress with water and the half-melted pill and asked for another pill. She swallowed it, then leaned against the head of the bed and dozed off. An hour later, Jane woke up to meet the prying eyes of Madame Joan. Has she been watching me sleep? She wondered. There was a package lying stylishly at the foot of her bed. "What's that?" Jane asked, pointing at the strange package. "I thought you would need this. Don't forget to use it," Madame Joan replied. passing the package to Jane's outstretched hand and turning to leave the room. Jane stopped her upon seeing the content of the package. "What's this you've brought for me?" she asked. Before Madame Joan could answer, a knock was suddenly heard on the door. "Is the young madame around? I'm here to see her." Jane recognized the voice. "Yes," she managed to answer, scared that Madame Joan would notice the rivalry between her and her so-called brother-in-law. Madame Joan opened the door and greeted the young master politely. "Good morning, sister-in-law," he greeted cheerfully. "Good morning," Jane replied weakly. Madame Joan noticed her discomfort and excused herself. She might as well get Jane a plate of soup to calm her stomach ache. Kennedy's eyes left Jane's face and settled on the test kit beside her. "I didn't know my brother has had a taste of you," he blurted out, a smirk playing on his lips. Jane frowned. "Do I owe you any explanation for whatever happens between my husband and me?" Kennedy suddenly burst into laughter. "I wonder what you saw in an unromantic jerk like my brother. He's probably in the arms of one of his numerous mistresses, and you're here bearing the pain of pregnancy alone. You will not speak about my husband in such a manner." Jane fired back, her voice trembling with anger. The discomfort in her stomach was increasing, and so was the weakness. She could barely raise herself off the bed. Else she would have slapped Kennedy for spewing such trash in her presence. "Leave my room. I do not want to ever see you around me again." "What right do you have to ask me to leave?" Kennedy fired back, his eyes narrowing. "She has every right." A cold voice rang out, leaving Jane and Kennedy stunned. John's constant rivalry with Jane was beginning to get to him. He might not want her for a wife, but he couldn't stand her having anything to do with his younger brother. "Brother, I came by to see how my sister-in-law is faring." "Heard she's sick," Kennedy admitted between a throaty cough. John eyed him in disdain. "Are you going so soon? Are you done seeing my wife?" Kennedy gave a weary smile. "Of course. I was about to leave." Jan lowered the jar of water in his hand on the table beside Jane. "Why don't you continue the discussion you were having before I came in?" Jane shook her head repeatedly. "I would prefer to be left alone." "I insist." Kennedy's eyes scanned the room before resting on John's angry face. "Brother, I need to catch up with an urgent meeting," he said, showing the obvious message on his phone screen. John's face creased into a frown, and his Adam's apple pulsated heavily as he swallowed hard. The doctor was yet to return with the test result. It was very unlike him to delay providing results to any member of the E family. John was anxious to get the result and have Jane thrown out of the house by his father himself. He would be highly disappointed in her, he thought as a slight smile crossed his face. In the dining room, John stared at his untouched food. He found it difficult to eat anything other than what Jane cooked. Jane was a good cook, but he would never admit it, not to Jane or any other person. Suddenly, Madame Joan approached the dining table in a haste. "Young master, Madame has become terribly sick." Terribly sick? John thought. Was she pretending to be sick to avoid doing her duties? "Young master, I think she needs to be taken to the hospital," Madame Jan said, her voice filled with concern. John sighed before covering his untouched food. "It's just a minor fever. She doesn't need to be taken to the hospital," he asserted coldly. Madame Jones shook her head repeatedly. "She's been vomiting too and has refused to eat anything since yesterday. Moreover, she took care of you when you were in a coma. You're obviously overstepping your boundaries," John warned, his voice laced with steel. Dad wasn't the only one Jane had won over with her charms. Madame Joan had also been caught in her web. As the oldest servant in the house, she was one of the most caring. But with Jane, it was more than usual. She treated Jane with so much reverence, not because she was John's supposed wife, but because she truly cared about her. John couldn't pretend to eat the food anymore. The food wasn't bad. He could tell from the aroma, but his appetite was gone, and he blamed Jane for it. "Young master, the doctor is here," one of the servants said as she stuttered into the dining room. Some hours earlier, Jane had gotten up from the bed. Her mouth had gone dry, and her tongue parched from the constant fever. She stretched out her hand for the cup of water on the table, her eyes rolling immediately as another pang of nausea hit her. Even if she threw up, she was sure there was nothing left in her stomach. She hadn't eaten anything, and her nausea wasn't making it easy for her to eat something. So much had taken place in her body since the day John woke up. She had blamed it on the constant errands he kept her busy with, but now she was almost certain that assumption wasn't true. After calming herself down, she saw the package Madame Joan had brought in earlier. It was lying neatly beside her bed, and the pregnancy test kit caught her attention. She decided to carry out a test. There was no harm in trying since the test kit was already there. Inside the bathroom, her heart skipped repeatedly as she beheld the change in the color of the strip. "I can't be pregnant," she stuttered, her voice barely audible. "This can't possibly be true. It must be some fake product," she finally concluded nervously. She packed up the evidence and flushed it down the toilet. She would figure out a lie to tell Madame Joan when she eventually asked for the test strip. Jane quickly took out her phone and dialed the doctor's number. He was kind enough to have left his number with her the previous day. After a moment, he picked up and responded cheerfully. "Madam, you called just in time to get the good news. Just like I suspected, you're 3 months pregnant," he announced. Jane went silent, unsure of how to respond. There was no way the test strip and the doctor could both be wrong. She was actually pregnant. "My husband will be happy to hear about this," she said, pretending to be happy. "But I don't want anyone to know about this yet, doctor. Can you keep this a secret for now?" she pleaded. The doctor was alarmed. He wasn't used to such reactions and wondered why. "Your husband has asked for the result. I was actually getting ready to see him today with the result. I really want to surprise him myself," she explained. "Please, can you lie to him for now?" The doctor knew how brutal John could be. He confirmed this in his. Before the accident, he knew this woman, now feigning innocence, understood the price she could pay for pulling a costly prank on him. It was as if she'd plucked the thought straight from his mind when she interjected, her voice laced with swift assurance. "I promise you, I will tell him when the time is right, and I'll make damn sure he doesn't take his anger out on you." He breathed a sigh of relief, a weight lifting from his shoulders. If she was truly confident in her ability to manage the situation, he would be more than happy to lend a hand. Besides, there was a certain thrill in the idea of playing with the emotions of the almighty Johnny. "Of course, I'll help you," he replied, a sly grin playing on his lips. Later that day, Madame Joan, her face etched with a quiet concern, pushed open the door to the dimly lit room she shared with Jane. They had concocted a hasty lie for John's father when he questioned why Jane was sleeping in the maid's quarters instead of in the master bedroom beside her husband. "The young master won't be able to take proper care of her in her current condition," she had explained, her voice laced with a feigned sympathy. Seeing Jane still lying on the bed, her eyes closed, Madame Joan approached her quietly, her footsteps barely disturbing the silence. If nobody else cared enough to look after the young madam, it was her duty to nurse her back to health. "Madame Joan, you're back," Jane mumbled, stirring in her sleep. "Young madam, I brought some soup for you. It will help settle the nausea." Jane couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly amiss. Why hadn't the young madame been taken to the hospital? Her boss seemed utterly devoid of empathy for his wife. "I don't want to eat anything, Madame Joan. I just want to visit the hospital." She paused, a shadow of worry crossing her face. "I overheard the young master talking to someone in the living room. I think it was the family doctor." Jane's heart skipped a beat, and she gripped the bedpost for support, her knuckles white. What if he had told John the truth about her pregnancy? "I was just about to call you," John said, stretching out his hand to the doctor for a handshake, a predatory glint in his eyes. "That makes 2 of us," the doctor replied cheerfully. "I have lots of patients to attend to, so I might as well get going," he said, handing John a white envelope containing the test result. John released a cocky smile, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. He was finally going to send Jane packing, out of the house, without his father's interference. He was about to tear open the envelope when a servant sauntered into the living room to tell him that his father was waiting for him in his study room. His father was accustomed to summoning him to the study room whenever he had something of grave importance to discuss. John quickly tucked the letter into his back pocket as he made his way to the study room, his mind racing. "Have a seat, John. I have been waiting for you," his father said, his voice carrying a hint of impatience. John tried to calm his wayward nerves, his palms sweating. The last time his father had called him into the study room, it was to remind him of his place as the heir of the E family. Now, he was anxious about the reason his father had sent for him. "So, I have been thinking, since your wife is now pregnant, wouldn't it be nice if you two went on a vacation?" "Dad, how are you so sure about this?" As much as he wanted the result to be positive, he also feared it could be a mere assumption. Reaching into his back pocket, John retrieved the white envelope and flipped it open, revealing the typed document bearing his supposed wife's test result. His eyes scanned the content until they rested on the portion that boldly affirmed that his wife's pregnancy test turned out to be negative. "How come?" he voiced aloud, forgetting that his father was in the study room with him. His father peered at him with concern. "What happened?" "She's not pregnant," John said, dropping the test result onto his father's outstretched palm. The father took a fierce look at the paper in his hand before lifting his face to stare at John's angry expression. "I thought you didn't want a child badly? Why are you so bothered by this?" the puzzled father asked, handing the piece of paper back to John. "Shouldn't you be in a merry mood right now?" he questioned, his brow furrowed in confusion. John couldn't bring himself to unveil the real reason for his anger. His father had clearly misunderstood his sudden outburst. John had meticulously planned how he was going to send Jane back to her wretched family, whose lives revolved around money. Even though he hadn't been conscious when the payment was made, his mother had informed him that his father had paid her family handsomely for her hand in marriage. He was not about to blow his cover and expose his plans to his father. So, he feigned agreement with his father's earlier claim and was rewarded with a warm pat on the shoulder. "Don't worry, I'm sure she will get pregnant soon," his father said, oblivious to the turmoil raging within his son. John's face went bright red at the mention of the word pregnancy. His father might as well continue in his dream of him having a grandchild with Jane. Since John couldn't divorce her because of his father's wishes, he might as well agree to the trip proposed by his father. On the way, he would scare her into running away from him and agreeing to a divorce. He might even pay her off. She was from a gold-digging family, and he was sure she wouldn't be any different from her parents who had sold her off. But before then, he would ask his driver to take her to the hospital for treatment. It would be difficult to take her on the trip while she was very sick. A tap on his shoulder jolted him out of his reverie. He turned to behold the mocking gaze of his mother. "You didn't tell me you were coming," he said excitedly, enveloping her in a firm hug. He had clearly missed spending time with his mom. He was always hopeful that she and his father would settle their differences. "Do I need permission to visit my own house again?" the bemused woman asked, touching him lightly on the cheek. "Of course not. I just wasn't expecting you anytime soon," he replied, smiling sheepishly at how easily she could make him laugh. "Mom, don't you think you're aging backward?" he teased her. She burst into loud laughter, taking a quick turn and boldly flaunting her beautiful gown and matching pair of stilettos. "My future wife will come to you for some classes." The stunned mother abruptly stopped to glare at him. "What did you say? What about Jane?" He scoffed at the mention of Jane's name. "She's Dad's new wife." Jane's mind seemed to drift to her poor brother in the hospital. She was yet to see him since the last time she visited him. Her earlier fear was suddenly getting magnified. If John found out about her pregnancy, he would divorce her, and her chance of selling her shares to him wouldn't be possible. She muttered a silent prayer, her eyes slowly meeting with Madame Jones' concerned look. "Madam, what's the problem? You look worried," she asked. "When will the young master leave the house?" Jane asked, with the hope of leaving for the hospital where Liam, her brother, was kept. Madame Jones looked at the direction of the door before answering. He will be leaving in the next few minutes. His driver is here already. Jane felt relieved. His absence would make it easier for her to leave the mansion. Can I trust you to cover up for me in my absence? I will cover for you, young madam, Madame Joan promised, her eyes filled with a genuine concern. Jane was suddenly overwhelmed by emotions. Not only had Madame Joan been good to her, but she was also taking the risk of covering up for her. Madame Joan, I promise to take you out of here once I become wealthy, she said, her voice thick with emotion. As soon as Madame Joan asked to go back to her duties in the kitchen, her promise didn't make any sense to her. It felt like a promise made by an infant desperate for his mom's attention. Jane waited until the young master had driven off from the mansion before she stuttered to the gate alongside Madame Joan. She knew it would be impossible to step out of the gate without her assistance. The guards were more conversant with Madame Joan than with her. Where are you both going? The guard asked, raising an eyebrow. We need to pick up some groceries from the stores, Madame Joan replied. Although Jane was the young madam of the home, she was not entirely treated as one, and that's because her supposed husband had chosen to reduce her to his personal maid instead of his wife. The guards on duty were a new set and didn't look like they knew her. They were probably yet to see the wife of their young master. Jane tugged lightly at her scarf, covering her face, revealing only a part of her eyes. Who's she? The guard asked, pointing at Jane. She's my younger sister, Madame Joan answered, her voice steady. The guard took a fierce glance at them before waving them through the gate. Outside, Jane ordered a ride, and they waited patiently until the car pulled up beside them on the pedestrian walkway. At the hospital, the doctor looked at her brother's test report before asking her to see him in his office. I have some bad news for you, he said, his eyes glinting with an unsettling light. The thought of the worst-case scenario flashed through her mind. Really? She forced herself to ask. Yes, but I might be able to remedy the situation if you're willing to cooperate. After struggling to calm her nerves, she looked up to meet the doctor's flirty eyes peering down at her. What do you mean? She stuttered, suddenly feeling uncomfortable being alone with him in his office. Jane, why are you acting so difficult? You know I care about you, he purred, his voice dripping with false concern. She wanted to cry out in frustration. She was thinking about saving her dying brother, and this despicable doctor was looking for a way to sleep with her. Picking up the glass of water on his table, she swiftly emptied the contents on his white coat. Go to hell, she fired as she marched out of the office to meet the bemused face of her supposed husband at the door. Don't you have a thing for harassing all the men you come across? He sneered, his eyes narrowed. How dare he accuse her of harassing the doctor when, in actual sense, he was the one trying to hit on her. She opened her mouth to speak, but he motioned for her to keep quiet. Better have a good reason for leaving the house without my permission, he sternly warned before knocking on the door, the same door she had just come out from. Jane was extremely nervous. What had she gotten herself into? She ran into her brother's ward to check on him. He was lying face up and was bare from his waist upward. Although he was fast asleep, his eyes suddenly lit up on feeling her presence inside the room. He managed to release a smile before his eyelids opened. His face looked paler than how it was the last time she visited. Why haven't you visited since the last time? He asked weakly, releasing a cough. She didn't want to tell him that she was sick and still is sick. The news would worry him. She couldn't also tell him that she was busy. He would assume she's become too busy for him. Rather, she came up with a more thoughtful lie. I was raising money for your surgeries, she replied, her voice laced with a desperate hope. John was sure he had given stern warnings to his guard not to allow her or any of his servants to leave the house without his permission. His chief security officer stood a foot away with his head bent like a criminal about to be hanged. I want you to get me a report of who allowed her out of the house without my permission, John boasted slowly before sauntering out of the room, his eyes burning with suppressed rage. I'm sorry for leaving the house without your permission, Jane said, her voice barely a whisper. He had planned to punish her for disobeying him, but as he stared at her fragile frame in front of him, he suddenly felt the need to protect her instead. What were you doing at the hospital? He suddenly asked after a momentary silence. I went to check on my sick brother. She had prepared herself for the worst. She might as well ask him for a divorce before he decided to punish her with it. I want to ask for a divorce, she stuttered, her eyes pleading. You want a divorce? John sneered, suddenly feeling overwhelmed by her admission. It's good you finally understood your place in my life. When did you suddenly come to this decision? She tugged at the hem of her dress, her heart feeling heavier than when she ran into him at the hospital. I guess I'm not worthy of being your wife, like you've always said. At least you can now opt for a lady who fits your prestige. Beaming with smiles, John fought the urge to circle her into his arms. I'm glad you're really saying this. I would admit that you're very bold. Coming to me to ask for a divorce speaks so much of how bold you are. Aside from her cooking skills, which he found to be excellent, she was quite annoying. Since she started preparing his dishes, he had not tasted any other food and found it to be tasty. I will grant you the divorce you seek once Dad returns, but Madam Jones said he traveled again and will only return next month. Well, you're right. He has gone for a business trip and will only return next month. Jane was worried. Asking for a divorce was the easiest way to escape the mansion before her pregnancy bump became visible. Next month would leave her at the risk of getting exposed. Staying longer in the villa would leave her at their mercy and at the peak of scandalous news headlines since her wedding to John was broadcasted nationwide. Why don't we get a court approval first? We can always explain to Dad when he returns from his trip. John was shocked and puzzled at the same time. It was true that he felt repulsed by her presence, but he wasn't willing to let her go, at least not yet. He didn't seem to understand why she was eager to divorce him all of a sudden. Could it be that there was something up her sleeve, and she was demanding a divorce to cover it up? Why should I agree to your proposal? How dare you negotiate with me? Wasn't our marriage without your permission? Isn't this what you've always wanted? He paused, his eyes glinting with malice. I call the shots. I make the decisions too. Back in her room, Jane tossed and turned as sleep eluded her. It wasn't bedtime yet, but she was still feeling weak and needed to rest her head a little. The door suddenly came open, and Madam Jones skipped into the room, bearing a plate of food. Madam, you're back so soon. How was what you went for? I had some drugs prescribed for me, Jane said, showing the wrap pack beside her on the bed. The doctor thinks I have a cold. That's a relief. I thought it was something more. At least a cold will definitely go away after some days. Madame Joan quickly added, her voice laced with relief. Jane could have felt relieved, except that she wasn't down with a cold. She was pregnant, and the weirdest thing was that she didn't want to believe it. But who could be responsible for her pregnancy? JN would find out whatever secret she was hiding. The first time he mentioned divorce to her, she was jittery. Now, she's the one proposing it. He picked up his phone and dialed an unknown number. I want you to monitor my wife's every movement from now henceforth. Madame Joan handed Jane some chunks of dried meat. Madam, here's for you. Jane recoiled as another wave of nausea hit her. Madame Joan was suddenly terrified. Madam, are you sure this is just a cold? My stomach aches, although I have had my medications already. I think it's one of the side effects of the medication. Madame Joan didn't see the need to get more suspicious anymore. She believed her. I am getting overly worried now. The morning sickness would persist, and soon her secret would be open to all. Before sleeping that night, Jane made some silent prayers before digging out an ancient book about women in pregnancy. She opened the first pages and began reading with great interest. The first pages were on early signs of pregnancy. As she read with keen attention, her mind slowly delved to her childhood days when she was forced to stay with her grandmother during holidays. Her grandmother was a great medicine woman who derived so much joy in treating people for the tiniest amounts. She was notable for using unusual techniques to treat illnesses. Although Jane was young to understand these things, she was proud of her grandmother and her rare abilities to help people in need. She totally blamed herself for not picking interest in her grandmother's career. Maybe she would have been quite established just like her grandmother was. Her grandma's words still rang a bell in her ears. If you learn a little about my work, you will equally be respected in the future. She had always told her while patting her slowly on the shoulder. Well, maybe the work was rather too stressful that she didn't see the need to have the slight interest in it, but she was kind enough to give her this ancient book as a farewell gift, and she was really grateful for it. She suddenly smiled as she came to a particular page that seemed to have what she was looking for. Following the instructions in the book, she carefully picked up a needle and was about to plunge it into her flesh when the door burst open. "Madam, what are you doing?" Madame Joan asked, concern written all over her face. Startled, Jane dropped the needle and looked up to meet her gaze. "It's nothing, ma'am. It's just an ancient method for dealing with stomach upsets." Madame Joan's face suddenly lifted into a warm smile. "Of course, I know it. I'm shocked to see that you also know it." Beaming with smiles, Jane announced proudly, "Well, it's some of the tricks I picked up from my grandma." She didn't mean to tell lies, but she was glad that the fake grin on her face didn't sell her off. She slowly pushed the book into her duvet, careful not to expose the title to Madame John's full glare. If John dared to find out that she was pregnant, she was sure she wouldn't be leaving the mansion as a complete piece. She smoothly inserted the needles into her belly. After a while, she felt relieved. It was unexpectedly effective, but she couldn't say if it would also be able to deal with the morning sickness. "I think I'm feeling hungry now," she happily announced, throwing her hands into the air. Madame Joan was really happy. It was the first time Jane was requesting food since her illness started. She juggled out of the room excitedly before Jane changed her mind. The method had always proven to be quite effective. She had tried it before now, and it worked perfectly well, but she wasn't sure if it would also be able to save her in this case. Soon, Madame Joan was back with a plate of cake and a glass of orange juice. The smell of the cake didn't nauseate her like most foods did. She slowly picked a piece and chewed noisily on it until her eyes caught Madame Jan's thin smile. "My manners," she jokingly admitted. "I do not chew food this noisily." Touching her lightly, Madame Joan replied, "You don't have to apologize. I'm glad you're finally having the appetite for something." The room was suddenly calm, with no sound from either her or Madame Joan. The only sound was the one coming from her moving lips as they closed in and out on the tasty cake Madame Joan gave her. Taking the last bite of the cake, she exhaled deeply before adjusting her glance to the woman beside her. "Madam, do you have any family?" "Of course I have a family. I have a husband and a teenage son." Jane's eyes lit up excitedly on hearing about her son. "How was his delivery? Did he disturb you so much?" It was as if the older woman had been expecting her to ask about this long before now because she was suddenly ecstatic while giving her details. I actually didn't find out in time when I took in for him. He was clearly the best thing that has ever happened to me. Although I was young, I never attributed the usual early sickness and throwing up to pregnancy. I thought I was down with the flu." "Really?" "Yes, I was young and naive and my parents were late." Jane shook her head in pity and patted the older woman slightly on her arm. "I'm really sorry about the death of your parents. It must have been difficult living life without them." "Yes, it was," she admitted, wiping her face as a stray tear found its way down. "I found out about my pregnancy in the 3rd month." Jane quickly calculated her own pregnancy from the test results. She would almost be over 3 months when John's father would be returning from his trip. She wouldn't dare stay in the house till then. She would go back to JN and insist on the divorce. It was the only way to leave the house without being shamed by the Ease family, who derived so much joy in shaming people who were not up to their class and yet wanted to have anything to do with them. In order to keep Jane within his reach and not loitering around, John decided to take her with him for his physiotherapy sessions with his doctor. He was done with the session, and his eyes scanned the empty room for a sign of her. Was she so fond of walking about? Just some minutes ago, she was there, staring at him in the most insane way, and now she was nowhere to be found. The door suddenly opened, and there she was, her innocent face clearly betraying her true nature. "Where did you go?" I was in the restroom," she stuttered, her eyes straying from his feet to his unclad chest. Although she had seen him naked before while she bathed him in his unconscious state, He was stretched to his full height now, and she could barely look him in the face without standing on her toes. "What are you staring at?" he bellowed, his voice filled with irritation. Her face suddenly flushed when she realized that he had caught her staring. "Nothing," she muttered slowly, bending her head to stare back at his feet. "I want my shoes back on my feet." The doctor had advised him not to do any strenuous thing. Bending was not part of such things, but he was always looking for every opportunity to belittle her. She quickly ran to where he stood and bent to help him with his shoes. Her shaky hands seemed to be noticed by him. "What's with the delay? Are you so incompetent that you can't buckle ordinary shoes?" "I'm having a hard time with it, sir." Shoving her off, he bent to wear the shoes himself. "I should have known that you're useless," he fired, his voice laced with contempt. She was about to scurry away when she heard a squirm. Followed by a loud thud, he found himself sprawled face down on the floor, his knee twisted at an unnatural, painful angle. The sight was almost comical, yet undeniably awkward. A laugh tickled at her throat, but she swallowed it down, knowing that such an act could very well sign her death warrant. Instinctively, she reached out to help him up, a gesture that was met with a snarl of anger. He was furious that she hadn't buckled his shoes properly. Even his 2-year-old niece knew how to do it. He had shoved her away, determined to do it himself, when suddenly, he'd found himself crashing to the floor. Ashamed and defeated, he'd chosen to lie still, hoping to regain some semblance of composure. But there she was, hovering beside him, feigning concern. "Are you going to help me? Or would you rather watch me struggle, just like you did with the shoes?" he asked coldly, relishing the flicker of fear that danced across her face. He tightened his grip on her throat, a cruel satisfaction washing over him as he watched her squirm, her hands instinctively clawing at his. Jane felt the air around her thin, then vanish altogether. Panic surged through her as her face flushed crimson, her lungs screaming for oxygen. She tugged desperately at his hands, her vision blurring at the edges. "Let go of me," she managed to scream, the sound a mere croak as the air was forced from her lungs. Her eyes grew misty, and a harsh cough escaped her lips as he suddenly released her, sending her crashing onto the bare floor, her tailbone taking the brunt of the impact. "That makes 2 of us," he pointed out, his eyes gleaming with a fresh, chilling pride at what he had done to her. He was back on his feet in an instant, towering over her prone form, his gaze fierce and unwavering. He sighed heavily, a theatrical gesture, before brushing the non-existent dust from his clothes. "If you ever repeat what you did here today, I will make sure you're chased into the streets where you belong." Had he suddenly forgotten that she had already filed for divorce? Or was this just another empty threat? She resolved to push his buttons more often, to irritate him to the point where he would finally grant her the divorce she so desperately craved. She had an appointment with Mr. Todd, one of her mother's business associates, who was interested in buying her share of the family business. If he could pay immediately, the shares would be transferred to his company, and she would finally be able to schedule Liam's surgery and pay the mounting medical bills. Suddenly, she heard footsteps approaching. It was Kenneth, John's despicable younger brother. "Bro, sister-in-law, hope I'm not interrupting anything," he said, struggling and failing to suppress a smirk. "What do you want?" John snapped, ignoring the pleasantries. Ken's gaze swept over Jane's flushed face before settling on his brother. "I came to see you." It was time for her to leave the room. She would rather be outside, basking in the sun, than trapped in the same space with the 2 brothers. As she walked towards the open door, she brushed past Ken, shooting him a glare fierce enough to incinerate him, if looks could kill. He didn't know whose presence repulsed him more, Jane's or his brother's. John motioned for Ken to speak, eager to be rid of him as quickly as possible. "Mr. Todd brought some documents he wants you to sign." Ken held out the papers, not daring to meet his brother's gaze. "What is it about?" John asked, his voice sharp. Ken gave a fake cough before adjusting his already perfectly straight collar. "Your wife wants to sell her share of the family business to him." John's eyes snapped open with interest as he snatched the papers from Ken. He sneered as he scanned the contents. So, this is why she's so confidently asking for a divorce. He would make sure nobody bought the shares from her. Turning to his brother, he coldly demanded, "Ask my wife to see me." She had left the room to breathe in some fresh air. Sharing the same space with John felt suffocating, not because he took her breath away with desire, but because he filled her with pure revulsion. She gently touched her belly, caressing it dreamily. Whether she knew the father of her child or not, she was determined to keep the baby. She had been hesitant before, unsure of her decision, but now she was resolute. She would raise this child with or without her family's support, and that would only be possible if she could divorce John. "Jane?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. She instinctively placed her hands on her still flat belly, protecting her unborn child. Her motherly instincts were already kicking in, even though the baby was barely formed. She turned to find Ken smiling down at her, his gaze flirtatious despite his brother being just a few meters away. Startled, she asked, "What do you want? Can't I check up on my brother's wife? Or has it suddenly become a crime to care about you?" He replied, his earlier silly smirk now more pronounced with John's absence. "If your brother sees you flirting with me, he will definitely have your head on a platter," she fired back, sneering. He slowly whispered, "Doesn't look like I'm the one about to be killed. Your husband wants to see you right now." She nervously walked back into the room, eager yet scared to find out what she had done wrong. As soon as she entered, John threw a stack of documents at her, the ones his brother had brought in earlier. "Is this why you wanted to divorce so much?" he shouted. She couldn't believe her eyes. The documents she was supposed to sign with Mr. Todd were now on the floor. How did John get them? Was Mr. Todd his business partner? Questions raced through her mind as she took a few steps backward, aware of how violent John could be. "How did you get these documents?" she demanded calmly, careful not to aggravate his already steaming anger. "You still have the nerve to ask me questions? Did you think I wouldn't find out about your involvement with Mr. Todd?" he snarled. "But I haven't done anything wrong. I needed the money to—" Raising his hand, he snapped at her so hard that she flinched in pain. "Oh, shut up and save me the sermon. You wanted the money to elope with a new love. I will make sure every single cent he pays you goes directly into my account. If you want a divorce, you might as well pay back every single dime my family spent on you and your family during the marriage rites." She opened her mouth to speak but quickly decided against it. "And I mean every single dime," he added, his voice dripping with venom. Why was he so bent on punishing her? She could endure all the torture and pain of staying married to him, but her brother's life was at stake. It was the only way out of it. "Why are you doing this? You don't need the money. Why do you derive so much joy from hurting me?" she shouted, shooting an angry stare at him. His eyes squinted almost immediately. "Do you think my family picks money from trees? I bet if it were so, people like you and your useless family wouldn't be as wretched as you are." She took a few more steps backward before continuing. "I swear, I didn't get a dime from the money your father gave to my family. They should be the ones paying back, not me." "Then get them to pay," he sneered, his voice laced with contempt. In tears, she hurried back outside. Even if she told him what she needed the money for, he wouldn't budge. She had already signed her part of the documents, which meant she no longer had access to the ownership of the business. It was now his. Suddenly, her phone rang. "Meet me at Molina Lounge," a hoarse voice stated before hanging up. He couldn't believe the lengths she was going to divorce him. Did she really hate him that much? Well, he didn't care. She could hate him all she wanted. He would never sign the divorce papers, not even if her life depended on it. A knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. "Sir, your mother is here. She's waiting downstairs." Why did his mom always act like a stranger each time she visited her own house? In the living room, he saw her grinning widely as he descended the stairs. "Hello, son, you don't look well at all. Is your wife not taking care of you like she should? Should I arrange for—" "Mom, I'm okay. Thanks for asking." He cut her off abruptly. Touching his cheek, she peered into his eyes as if doubting his words. He was not a child, plus they had many maids in the mansion, and she knew that. "Where is she?" she finally asked. Who? Your wife, of course. John paused before asking a servant to fetch Jane from her room. Jane, almost forgetting she had a difficult mother-in-law, clambered down the stairs excitedly. Hello, mother-in-law, she greeted. The middle-aged woman forced a smile. Why are you looking so unkempt and frail? She asked, her tone ambiguous. Was she taunting or genuinely concerned? Jane couldn't tell. The woman was no different from her despicable son. Sometimes she wished he had taken after his father's gentle nature. I'm okay, anyways, that's not why I'm here, she snapped. I want to know if you've been taking care of my son like you ought to. He is the sole reason why you're here in the first place. Of course, you must know that he's the reason your family is finally experiencing good things. Jane looked at her husband, who had an expressionless look on his face, making it impossible to tell what was going through his mind. Standing up from his seat, he brushed past the two women. Mom, I will be having a session in the next few minutes. I need to get ready. Do you go with him? Or have you suddenly forgotten your duties? Jane wiped her brows nervously. No, ma'am. He was preparing for his swimming classes. He didn't need to swim to stay fit. He was already fit, but his nosy doctor would never accept that. Suddenly, he heard a knock on the door. He knew it was her. Come in, he answered, waiting until she pushed the bathroom door open and slowly entered. Jane couldn't believe her eyes. Her husband was lying in the bathtub, leisurely drinking from a wine glass. Was he choosing the bathtub over the pool? She stared at his almost exposed chest and quickly looked away, embarrassed. I don't think you need me since you're opting for this instead. Why are you feeling uncomfortable watching me bathe? He asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. Not at all. I just feel you wouldn't need me, she muttered under her breath. Well, that's on the contrary because I need my feet massaged. She ran to the edge of the bathtub, her eyes catching a glimpse of his bare chest. Although he was immersed in the water, she could still make out his well-trimmed abs. Are you done staring? He asked, jolting her back to reality. Instinctively, her hands reached for his first foot, rubbing slowly at first before increasing the tempo on his demand. I want my waist massage too. Was this man so shameless? Did he really want her to massage his waist? How was she going to do that without putting herself in an awkward position? She hesitated, silently praying for him to change his mind. What are you waiting for? He barked. Her left hand reached under the water until she felt his waistline and began to massage gently. Suddenly, her hand strayed and touched the bulge between his legs. She flinched and quickly withdrew her hand, but not before he grabbed her by the neck and pushed her into the bathtub. Even in the water, he continued to press her neck, almost choking the life out of her. I should have known you were looking for an opportunity to touch me, he sneered. She struggled in the water, kicking and splashing water all over the bathroom. Satisfied with her squirming, he brought her out of the water and made her face him. Don't you dare try this next time, he sneered, shoving her out of the bathtub. She wouldn't dare, not after what he had just done to her. He knew it wasn't her fault. He had seen the shock on her face, and it seemed convincing enough. But that smell, it was the same smell from the night he saved a helpless girl from being assaulted by her boyfriend, the same night he got into an accident that left him unconscious for years. She trembled as she ran out of the bathroom, almost in tears. He let himself back into the bathtub, an obvious grin crossing his face at the thought of her crying because of him. She ran into her room and met Madame John's probing gaze. Madam, what happened to you? Joan asked. Nothing, Jan hastily answered before dashing into the bathroom to rid herself of her wet clothes. When she was done drying up, she changed into a new set of clothes and went into the kitchen to prepare dinner. Suddenly, the door opened, and John was standing there, his eyes more threatening than ever. He angrily threw a report at her, his bloodshot eyes shooting daggers. Is this why you wanted to divorce so badly, you despicable thing? How dare you? He shouted. She stared at him in shock, wondering what he was talking about. Did you think I would never find out that you're pregnant? He continued. Before she could open her mouth to speak, he strode over to her, shaking in fear, and slapped her hard across the cheek. "You are not just a gold digger, he fired. Tears began to stream down her face as she thought of the trouble she was in with the news of her pregnancy. "Speak up. Whose child are you carrying?" he demanded. Jane felt her body grow cold with fear, and she began to tremble all over. "I don't know," she stuttered. "I won't repeat this question again, and trust me, if I don't get the answer I seek, you will be blamed for whatever happens to you. For the last time, who is responsible for your pregnancy?" he shouted. It was true that she had never been with any man before him, and she couldn't remember sleeping with him either. "I haven't been with anyone since I came into this house," she said, scared he wouldn't believe her if she told him she was still a virgin. John's anger surged even more. He grabbed her neck and began to squeeze it until she cried out for help. "What other lies do you have up your sleeve? You can't think I'm responsible for your pregnancy," he snapped. Jane turned her head away, unable to meet his gaze. She was sure his eyes alone could kill her. The pressure of his hand on her neck increased, and soon she saw herself running out of air. Her face turned red from lack of oxygen, and a feeble hand clung to him in pain. "Please let me go," she pleaded. John gritted his teeth. "Are you going to tell me or not?" What could she say? She couldn't think of anything to pacify him. "I will tell you, just let go first," she stammered. He stilled his hold on her neck, waiting for her to speak, his eyes growing impatient. "It's Ken's," he accused. She shook her head in response. She couldn't agree to an obvious lie just to be set free from him. Tears glistened in her eyes, and her hands shook in fear. "Then who is it?" he demanded. "I don't know," she cried. Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, he finally let go. Jane fell to the ground, gasping for air. The sudden relief made her understand the importance of life. "If you refuse to speak up, I will go about it my own way," he threatened. He immediately sent for Ken, who was oblivious to what he had gotten himself into and rushed in almost immediately. Ken was taken aback by the scene before him. His elder brother was standing above Jane with a very mean look that sent Ken shivering like never before. As soon as John saw him, he handed him a piece of paper. Ken was left wondering what the paper was about. He took a quick glance at it and was about to return it to John when his eyes caught sight of the hospital name and the name boldly written on it. What did it have to do with him? Why was his brother giving it to him? He was even more shocked when he turned the document over and saw that it was Jane's pregnancy test result. And it was positive. "Wow, sister-in-law is pregnant," he announced excitedly, as if the others were unaware of the truth. As the words left his mouth, he immediately regretted it. John's anger surged to the top in an instant. Suddenly, Ken felt a heavy slap land on his face, leaving him totally dazed. "Why did you hit me? Tell me, are you responsible for the pregnancy?" John shouted. Ken stared at him in shock. "I swear, I don't know what you're talking about. I do not." Before he could finish the sentence, another slap landed on his cheek. He clutched at his cheek, moving backward to avoid getting hit again. "Brother, believe me, I have never touched sister-in-law," Ken pleaded. John rolled his eyes in disgust at the thought of his brother touching Jane. "If the baby isn't yours, then whose is it?" he demanded. Ken stared at him in shock. "Brother, isn't the pregnancy yours? I thought you—" "Oh, shut up," John snapped, cutting him off. "Does it mean sister-in-law had an affair while in this house?" Ken asked, but instead of responding, John threw him a disdainful look before strutting out of the room, leaving Ken gaping at the sorrowful Jane who was sprawled on the floor in pain. Immediately after John left, Ken approached Jane and gave her a sly smile. "I should have known that you would frame me with your pregnancy," he taunted. "Attempting to seduce me wasn't enough. You even got pregnant with another man's child. How shameless of you." Jane pretended not to hear him. Ken became enraged with her calmness, and as he attempted to pull her up and teach her a lesson, he was suddenly stopped by an angry voice at the door. "Let her go this minute," the voice barked. Meanwhile, Jan locked himself in his study to avoid doing something terrible to Jane. From the fear on his brother's face, He could tell that Ken was not responsible for the pregnancy. Ken was a coward who would chicken out in the face of trouble. He was supposed to be happy that his prayers had been answered and Jane was finally getting thrown out of his house. But he didn't feel happy at all. It felt as if he had been stabbed in the chest, and the pain was excruciating. He couldn't believe that the woman he had thought was innocent was sleeping with another man while in his house. He wouldn't wait until his father returned before doing the needful, but before then, he would find out who the man was and make sure he was dealt with. In the kitchen, Jane couldn't believe her eyes. John's father was standing at the door with an expression she had never seen before. She had seen him angry at John a couple of times, but never so furious at someone like he was with Ken at the moment. "How dare you lay your filthy hands on her?" Mr. E asked, his voice trembling with anger. Jane stole a look at Ken, who seemed to be shaking in fear. "Father, when did you come back?" Ken asked. Mr. E ignored him and rushed to help Jane to her feet. Ken saw the opportunity to escape, but as he made to leave the room, he was bagged back by two guards who pushed him roughly to the floor where Mr. E stood holding Jane. "Take him away and have him punished thoroughly for messing with my daughter-in-law. And as for John, he better have a good explanation for the stories I'm hearing." "And what did you hear?" John's voice interrupted. He had changed into simple houseware and smelled terribly of alcohol. John was definitely shocked to see his father, and he was even more stunned to witness the guards leading his younger brother away, his father cradling Jane with one hand. He approached John and delivered a stinging slap across his face. "I wasn't joking when I said I would hurt anyone who harms Jane," Mr. E sneered. John was dumbfounded. His father had never laid a hand on him before. What did he mean by he would hurt anyone who hurt Jane? Jan hadn't even been in the room with Jane when his father arrived. So how did he know he was the reason behind her tears? "Father, you dare to slap me because of this woman?" John exclaimed incredulously. His father eyed him with disdain before leading the way to the sitting room. Jan was furious at his father, but even more so at Jane for turning his father against him. He hoped his father would apologize once he heard about her supposed escapades with other men. He waited until his father had taken a seat before settling in another seat far opposite his father's and Jan's. "I had to suspend my trip after I got the news of pregnancy. I knew you would be furious, so I decided to return home before you did something stupid," Mr. E began, peering at John's angry face. "I have been aware of everything going on from day one, but I was hoping you would come to love her and adore her as you should." John recoiled in anger at the mention of love. He would never love someone like her, not even in his next life. "I know you've already made your conclusions, and I don't blame you for it. But I also know you've been treating her like a maid, making her do all your chores when we have plenty of staff in this house. Isn't she worse than a maid?" John sneered, but his father immediately rewarded him with an icy gaze. "If you utter another word against her, you will regret what befalls you," Mr. E warned. Her eyes were already closing on the sofa where she sat with Mr. E when she suddenly felt a sharp pain in her lower abdomen and screamed out in agony. Mr. E grew terrified and alerted the guards, who rushed her to the hospital, the same hospital where Liam was being treated. After running a check on her, the doctor confirmed that it was nothing serious. Mr. E wasn't convinced. He was scared something bad might have happened to the baby because of the strenuous chores his son had made her do. "What about the baby, doctor? Is the baby okay?" he asked anxiously. "The baby is fine too. She just needs to rest more," the doctor assured him. Mr. shot an angry gaze at his son. It was all John's fault that she was in such a condition when she needed to be taken care of the most. Jane was discharged the same day, and following Mr. E's instructions, she was led into, instead of the usual cramped maid's quarters, she found herself in the sprawling master bedroom. John was visibly displeased with his father's decision, the thought of her presence grating on his nerves, let alone sharing his personal space, his bed. That night, after a silent, awkward bath, she donned her familiar pink nightgown and retreated to the farthest edge of the massive bed. She was careful not to provoke him further, knowing his father had already pushed him to his limit. John was conspicuously absent from the room when she emerged from the bathroom. Just as she began to drift off to sleep, the door creaked open, and his presence filled the vast space. She squeezed her eyes shut, feigning sleep, but no matter how hard she tried, slumber eluded her. Something about the room felt foreign, unsettling. She concluded it was simply that she wasn't used to being there. He had avoided the room since his father forced her upon him. He had briefly considered holing up in one of their numerous guest houses, but knew that would only infuriate his father further. He waited until he was reasonably sure she was asleep before venturing back into the master suite. The room was dimly illuminated by the single bedside lamp she had left on. He studied her still form, wondering if she was truly asleep or merely pretending. Suddenly, a soft, almost inaudible squirm escaped her lips. At first, he dismissed it as his imagination, but when he heard it a second time, he felt a reluctant obligation to check on her, despite his vow to never touch her. As his hand gently brushed against her shoulder, she jolted awake in fright, and he instinctively held her down to prevent her from tumbling off the bed. He hadn't realized the awkwardness of their position until he felt her hand instinctively grip his neck, the other finding purchase on his waist. He stared down at her, noticing for the first time the delicate features of her face, illuminated by the soft lamplight. He realized, with a jolt, that she was fast asleep, her head resting against his body. What the heck had he gotten himself into? He attempted to disentangle himself, but realized that any movement would likely wake her, a scenario he desperately wanted to avoid. Carefully, he laid her back down on the bed and settled beside her, still cradling her head. Her head nestled in the crook of his shoulder. She slept soundly, her breathing soft and even. Soon, he could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of her snores against his chest. Each breath a subtle vibration that strangely soothed him. When he tried to extract himself from her embrace, she made a small, snorting noise and clung tighter, her grip surprisingly strong. He finally surrendered, resigning himself to his fate, and lay beside her until sleep claimed him. It was morning. The bright sunlight streaming through the window jolted her awake. It had been a while since she had woken up feeling so refreshed. As she attempted to sit up, she suddenly noticed a firm hand gripping her waist, preventing her movement. Panic flared. She pushed at the hand, but it remained stubbornly in place, its owner equally unyielding. A look of shock crossed her face. Why on earth was John holding her? He had so vehemently opposed the idea of sharing a room with her, and now he was holding her as if they were intimate lovers. She was still processing the bizarre situation when the figure beside her shifted, and his hand on her waist loosened. Seizing the opportunity, she immediately rolled off the bed, but not before he caught her, pulling her back. His figure loomed over hers, casting a long shadow. "Let me go," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. He shot her a disdainful look. "Isn't this what you've always wanted?" Before she could utter a word, his lips clamped down on hers, a forceful, possessive kiss. He suckled on her lips as if his life depended on it. She had always dreamed of intimacy with her husband, but not like this, not with this anger simmering beneath the surface. She tried to push him away, but her struggles only intensified his grip, his touch now bordering on violent. Seeing that he wasn't letting go, she stilled her movements, remaining passive beneath him. But instead of continuing, John abruptly stopped, his face now etched with repulsion rather than desire. He shoved her away, sending her tumbling to the floor with a dull thud. She scrambled to her feet and fled into the restroom to wash up, desperate to erase the memory of his touch. In her haste, she forgot to grab a change of clothes. After bathing, she cautiously peeked through a crack in the bathroom door. Seeing that he was no longer in the room, she decided to make a dash for her clothes. But just as she entered the bedroom, the entrance door swung open, and John stood there, shock etched across his face. Was she trying to seduce him? He brushed past her shaky form and retreated into his study without sparing her a glance. No matter how much he tried to concentrate, his mind was a whirlwind of images of her from the room. He had bedded countless women in the past, but had never been so affected by any of them. In fact, he had never bedded a woman more than once. He always grew tired of them after the first night. Finally, he decided to force the thoughts away and focus on his work. Suddenly, a knock echoed through the study. He knew it wasn't any of the servants. They wouldn't dare disturb him when he was in his study. "Come in," he muttered, his voice gruff. The door slowly opened, and Jane stood there, her dress unzipped, revealing the curve of her spine. She pleaded with him to help her with it. At first, he wanted to ignore her, to pretend she wasn't there. But when he saw that she wasn't going to leave him alone, he reluctantly stood up and began to zip up the dress. As his fingers grazed her bare skin, he sucked in his breath, hoping she wouldn't notice his involuntary reaction. When he was done, she thanked him, her voice soft, and left for the room, but not before telling him that breakfast was ready and his father needed him downstairs. As he descended the staircase, his eyes caught sight of Jane sitting beside his seat at the dining table. He knew his father had instructed her to sit there. He forced a smile and politely greeted his father, who seemed to be smiling for the first time since returning from his trip. "Hope you slept well," his father muttered, his eyes twinkling. He wanted to tell him that his night had been ruined by the woman he had sent into his room, by the emotional turmoil she had stirred within him. But he decided it would only ruin his father's mood. Ken was seated at the far end of the dining room, munching on his food. He mumbled his greetings before continuing his meal. There were faint scratches on his face, and he looked like he had been given a good beating. Immediately John sat down. His eyes went straight to Jane's swollen lips. He had never truly looked at her lips before, but as he did, he regretted it. He could still remember the lingering taste of her lips and how they had yielded beneath his. "I have a confession to make," Mr. E began, startling everyone. The trio looked up at him in shock, wondering what the confession was about. "John, my son, I want you to know that the baby Jane is carrying is yours." Did he have to bring the pregnancy up? John thought. He had expected something of far greater importance. He stared at them for a moment before his father continued. "The night Jane was brought into the house, I was scared that you wouldn't recover, so I had one of the best doctors in town sedate Jane and had your sperm injected into her." Their mouths dropped open in shock, and they stared at their father as if he were a stranger. As for Jane, her hands flew to her lips, and she began to sob uncontrollably. She had been enduring all the pain and hardship inflicted on her by her husband because he believed she had cheated, when all along the pregnancy was his. Mr. E left his seat and went to console her. "It's okay, Jane. I promise no one will ever mistreat you again." John couldn't take it anymore. He slammed his fist on the table in anger before storming out of the dining room. Jane's POV. After the meal, she decided to go see Madame Joan. She knew the elderly woman would be sick with worry, since she hadn't seen her since returning from the hospital. "Young madam, where have you been?" Madame Joan exclaimed, enveloping her in a warm hug. Jane told her everything that had happened, from when she returned from the hospital to when she was asked by John's father to share his room with him. Madame Joan was ecstatic with joy. "I hope the young master comes to love you like his beloved wife," she muttered, enveloping Jane in another tight hug. "You really deserve all the happiness you can get." Jane returned to the room to find her husband only in his briefs. From the lingering scent of cologne, she was sure he was getting ready to go out. "Dad wants you to accompany me to a dinner party, so go and get ready," John announced, his tone curt. Jane couldn't believe her ears. Was he really asking her to go out with him? She brushed past him and went into the dressing room. Her clothes might be cheap, as he had once accused, but they were still beautiful, and she knew she could still turn heads while wearing them. She settled for a simple floral red gown with a thigh-high slit and picked out black stilettos to go with it. After dressing up, she pulled her hair into a simple bun and placed delicate rose petals on it. She stared at her reflection in the mirror and blinked twice with satisfaction. The figure standing before her was that of a dashing young lady. She didn't know what to expect from John. Would he compliment her dressing or tease her for wearing worthless clothes and jewelry? Pushing the door open, she slowly made her way into the room and sat on the edge of the large bed. John's shoes for the occasion were laid out beside the bed. After what seemed like an eternity, he walked into the room. Jane could swear that her husband was the hottest man she had ever laid eyes on. He was clad in a black suit with a matching tuxedo, his hair neatly combed to the left side, giving him a boyish look. She smiled to herself at the direction her thoughts were heading. "Why are you smiling?" John asked, his brow furrowed. She had thought she was fast enough, but apparently her husband had seen her. "Nothing, just remembered something," she replied, quickly wiping the smile off her face. He was expecting to see the ordinary girl he despised, but instead he saw an astonishing woman. She looked so beautiful and classy that he had to restrain himself from taking her into his arms. He quickly scolded himself for imagining such a thing about her. At the party, John refrained from introducing Jane to any of his friends. Although most of them knew he was married, they also knew how much he loathed his wife and how he would never bring her to any social occasion. But as they walked in, he noticed the way the men had their eyes on her, as if they wanted to undress her with their gaze. It made him angry and uncomfortable at the same time. He didn't care about her, but he couldn't stand the thought of another man having her either. He distanced himself from her and made her sit alone while he busied himself with some classy girls who were swooning around him since he walked into the party. All the while, his mind kept drifting to where Jane sat. She was no longer alone. She was now in the company of a young guy, and he seemed to be cracking her up with whatever he was telling her. John felt something in him squeezing, a sensation akin to anger. She had never laughed at anything he said, but here she was, shamelessly laughing at a total stranger's joke. Unable to stand the sight of the duo, he stood up from his seat and marched to where she was. Jane was shocked to see him and immediately stood up to meet him. Even in the dim light, she could make out the bloodshot stare he was shooting at her. "Who is he?" he bellowed, his voice laced with barely suppressed rage. She stared at him in fear, hoping he would calm down without creating a scene. "He was just keeping me company," she pleaded, her voice trembling. Not satisfied with her response, he roughly pulled her out of the place and into the car. "Since you can't respect simple orders, you will stay in this car alone until the party is over," he spat, slamming the door behind her. She didn't want to argue with him. She was even grateful. She would lie down and sleep while waiting for him. When John saw that she wasn't arguing with him, he locked the door. Just as he was about to leave, he saw the same guy coming toward them. He might flirt with her while she's in the car, he thought, his jealousy flaring, and made up his mind to stay in the car with her until the party was over. She expected him to return to the party, but here he was, back inside the car. Did he change his mind? She stole a glance at his expressionless face, but couldn't make out what he was thinking. Suddenly, his hands reached for her face, and he pressed his lips down on hers. This time it was less demanding, and his grip on her wasn't as firm as before. She had wanted to push him away, but suddenly her hands strayed to his neck and held him, urging him on. He deepened the kiss, his hands caressing her lower back, sending shivers down her spine. What was she doing? She couldn't possibly be giving in to a man who treated her so badly. She tried to push him away, but he was stronger, and with his body looming over hers, it was difficult to do anything. She relaxed, hoping he would release her like he did the last time. But instead of pushing her off, he began to nibble her neck. He started with tiny bites until she grew feverish with need. She brought her hands back to his neck and straddled him. He moaned into her ear before slowly releasing her. She was disappointed. Did she do something wrong? Why was he leaving her after turning her on? She looked so beautiful and classy that he had to restrain himself from taking her into his arms. He quickly scolded himself for imagining such a thing about her. John hooked their seatbelts and turned on the ignition. He couldn't explain what had gotten over him. If he hadn't controlled himself, he was sure he would have had her right there in the car. They drove in silence until they arrived home. She waited until he had gotten out of the car before following suit. If she did something to infuriate him, she might as well stay away from him to avoid aggravating him further. She slowly made her way to Madame Jones' room and knocked on the elderly woman's door. "Young madam, are you okay?" Did you quarrel with the boss again? Madame Joan asked, shocked to see her so late. After narrating what happened at the party, the elderly woman smiled. I think the boss has fallen for you already. He's only being overprotective of what is his, she taunted. The elderly woman advised her on what to do and asked her to go back to her husband, even though Jane insisted on passing the night in her room. John was sleeping on the bed when she walked in, his chest bare and only in his pajama pants. She changed into her nightwear and went to her corner of the bed. Just as her back touched the bed, John's eyes slowly opened. Where did you go? He asked, his voice thick with sleep. I went to see Madame Joan, she stuttered, avoiding his gaze. John rolled his eyes at her. Go to sleep, he sneered, turning away from her. She didn't want to sleep. She was no longer sleepy. She pretended to sleep while John stared down at her in anger. Why did he want her to sleep when she wasn't tired? She watched as he drifted off, and out of curiosity, she strayed her hands to his bare chest. He looked so peaceful when he was asleep, she thought as her exploration continued. At first he showed no reaction, but after a while he pulled her hands off his body and pushed her down until she was under him. Let me show you how it's done, he whispered in a husky tone, his eyes burning into hers. He kissed her softly on the lips, and when she didn't struggle, he deepened the kiss, his hands caressing her body through the opening of her nightgown. She stiffened and clung tighter to him. Then he pulled away and stared at her flushed face and swollen lips. He was enjoying her responses to his touches. He was eager to explore her body further but felt he needed her permission first. Do you want me to continue? He asked, his voice low and suggestive. She nodded almost imperceptibly, and he gave her a wicked grin. His hand went for her gown, and he carefully pulled it over her body, leaving her exposed skin to his view. She was beautifully attractive with flawless skin. He released a gasp as she tried to cover her body in shyness. He smiled at her, then pulled her hands away. I want to see you, he said, his voice laced with desire. She relaxed under his gaze, her fear receding. His hands circled her mounds, and she rewarded him with a moan. Suddenly, Jane screamed, the sound piercing the silence. I don't want this. John's eyes grew wide with shock. She had granted him permission only a few minutes ago. Why was she suddenly changing her mind? He stared down at the bulge between his legs and winced in obvious anger. Was she so insensitive not to consider him? Unable to do anything further, he went for a cold shower, hoping to quell the rising tide of frustration. When he returned, she was already fast asleep. He sighed and lay down beside her, careful not to touch her, all the while cursing her for playing with his emotions. She could have stopped him before he got aroused. The next morning, he woke up to see that her side of the bed was empty. She could be wherever she wanted. He didn't care anymore. She had caused him enough pain already. As he prepared to have a quick shower before heading to work, he heard a knock on the door. Sir, your father demands your presence downstairs, came the servant's voice, interrupting his thoughts. What did his father want from him again? He had done his part by accepting Jane against his will. He pulled a shirt over his body before strutting down the stairs to see his father. Mr. E was dressed in a brown suit with a wide grin on his face. Son, I was wondering if you would be free to accompany me to a fundraising event, he said, his tone unusually jovial. John was about to accept until he heard his father say, alongside your wife. His face creased into a frown at the thought of stepping out with Jane. The last time he went out with her, it was a total disaster. Dad, I need to be at the office before noon. I'm sure the meeting can be postponed. Call your personal assistant and have her reschedule it. Mr. E retorted, his smile unwavering. That was it. His dad wasn't going to change his mind for any reason. He immediately excused himself to get ready. Jane was inside the dressing room when he returned. She was clad in a simple floral gown that stopped right at her knees, her hair down, giving her an air of aloofness. She also had simple makeup on her face. I was wondering where you were. She started upon seeing him, her voice barely audible. Your dad was asking for you. John spared her a glance before walking into the bathroom to have his bath. She was such a good actress for putting on such a show after messing up with him last night. He would make sure to pay her back in her own coin. The E family arrived at the event looking as intimidating as ever. Most of the attendants had their eyes on Jane. It seemed it was her first public appearance. Just like at the party, most of the men were staring at her in a way he found disturbing. But before he knew it, he was offering her his arm and holding firmly to hers. She had expected him to leave her alone like he did the last time. She had prepared to keep herself busy on her phone during the function. But with the way her husband stood beside her, it almost made it impossible to move to any part of the venue without him accompanying her. The feeling of being around him was both sweet and strange. She liked the attention but also loved the fact that he wasn't willing to admit his growing emotions for her. She could tell he was clearly falling for her. She saw it in the way he stared at her and his overprotective nature. Madame Joan had told her that men only protect what they cherish. When Mr. E was called to make the opening remark, she was shocked when he called out her name and dedicated the fundraising speech to her sick brother. How did he know? She was sure she hadn't told him about it. She waited until he was done before rushing to meet him. Sir, how did you know that? Oh, you mean your brother? Well, you could thank your husband for it. He told me about Liam, Mr. E replied, beaming. Tears glistened in her eyes as she looked at her rigid husband with gratitude. She had never expected someone so mean to have human emotions. She wanted to hug him and thank him for considering her brother, but she was scared he would push her away if she dared. After the occasion, just as they made for their car, she was shocked to see the faces standing beside her with their heads bent in shame. Jane, we are truly sorry for hurting you, came the voice of her father. He was sitting in a wheelchair, looking haggard in his appearance. She ignored them and opened the car door but was restrained by her father-in-law. Jane, my dear, you need to hear them out, please. She pulled herself together as she stared at the faces of the people who betrayed her and sold her to the E family. What do you want? She forced herself to ask, her voice laced with bitterness. Her stepmother was the first to speak up. She didn't look her usual sophisticated self and appeared a bit slimmer. Jane, please forgive us. What was she saying? Why would they want her forgiveness after hurting her so badly? Did they suddenly remember her after hearing she was pregnant with John's child? Did they even care to visit her when she was suffering in the hands of her supposed husband? She looked away, wiping her tear-filled eyes. You treated me like I was nobody. You even sold me and yet never bothered to pay for my brother's hospital bills. How on earth am I supposed to forgive you? John was already growing impatient with the delay. He had a meeting to attend, and Jane and her gold-digging family were wasting his time. He looked at his father, who silently pleaded with him to wait a little longer. To avoid getting pissed, he excused himself to talk with a lady he had noticed was staring at him during the function. She was a very pretty lady, with an engaging smile. With a curvy body, John braced himself. He knew whatever Jane was about to say wouldn't be pleasant, but he had to endure it. Anything to avoid the complete emotional unraveling he felt bubbling beneath the surface. As they chatted and laughed with others, he became acutely aware of Jane's gaze fixed upon him. Even while engaged in conversation with her family, her eyes seemed magnetically drawn to him. Was she jealous? Impossible, he thought. She despised him, a feeling he wholeheartedly returned. On the drive home, he couldn't resist stealing glances at Jane. Her face remained an unreadable mask, and she didn't bother to meet his eyes, unlike before. A strange longing tugged at him. He almost wished she would look at him, maybe even scold him for talking to another woman. But she remained aloof, indifferent. His father, however, looked far from pleased. The car ride was suffocating in its silence until they finally arrived at the office. John desperately wanted to escape, to let the driver take his father and Jane home, but as he awkwardly climbed out of the car, he saw Jane and his father following suit. Midway through the office, his father placed a hand on his back. Son, I want Jane to see the office today, he declared. John simply nodded, his stomach twisting. As the elevator doors slid open, they marched into his office. Thankfully, the meeting scheduled for that afternoon was a lengthy one, offering him a much-needed reprieve from having to sit in his office all day, staring at Jane. When the meeting finally concluded, he found Jane sprawled on the sofa in his office, fast asleep. Her hair was down, a few unruly strands clinging to her face. An impulse, inexplicable and undeniable, took hold of him. He moved closer, gently brushing the stray hairs from her eyes. As his fingers grazed her skin, her eyes fluttered open. "So sorry," he stammered, pulling back his hand as if burned. "Your hair was sticking into your eyes." "Thanks," she muttered, her voice thick with sleep. She turned over, as if to resume her slumber, but the Sandman's spell had been broken. She stole a glance at her wristwatch and saw that it was already past lunchtime. She had clearly overslept in her husband's office. Stifling a yawn, she sat up on the sofa. John was staring at her, his expression unreadable, wondering what she was up to. When he saw her yawn, he figured she must be hungry and immediately asked his assistant to get her some food. He watched, fascinated, as her mouth formed a perfect O of shock when the food was brought to her. "Thank you," she murmured, her eyes wide before she dove into the meal. After she finished eating, he decided to give her a tour of the office. But as soon as they stepped out the door, she missed a step, and he instinctively reached out to catch her. Her hands, soft yet surprisingly firm, curled around his neck as he steadied her. He could tell she was still weak, so he called his driver and asked him to take her home. "I still have things to attend to in the office. I can't go home now," she protested, a pout forming on her lips as she clung to him. He felt a surge of conflicting emotions, annoyance, tenderness, and something else he couldn't quite name. He was left with no choice but to comply with her wishes, a fact that both irritated and intrigued him. He ended up carrying her, bridal style, to the car and gently placed her on the back seat, making her lie down across his lap. He hoped she would finally succumb to sleep once they got home, but instead of drifting off, she clung to his arm while on the bed. What had he gotten himself into? Jane was beginning to unearth a weak, emotional side of him he thought long buried. He had always prided himself on his iron will, his ability to control any situation. He would never follow a woman's orders, not even his mother dared to try. Yet here he was, doing Jane's bidding as if she were a queen and he her humble servant. As if hearing his thoughts, she turned and cradled his cheek in her hands. Before he could fully register what was happening, she was kissing him with reckless abandon. What was wrong with her? Was she on something? All of a sudden, he made to pull away, extract his lips from hers, but she bit down on his lower lip in a way he found surprisingly amusing. Was she teasing him, turning the tables, like he so often did to her? He was fighting a losing battle, desperately trying not to be led on by her, like last time. She probably wanted to tease him, lead him to the edge, and then leave him hanging, frustrated and wanting. But as he made to push her off, he suddenly heard her plea. "John, make love to me." John wondered if this was yet another one of Jane's elaborate schemes, another trap laid to ensnare him, like she had done the last time. If that was the case, she could forget about it. He wasn't going to fall for her games again. As he turned his gaze away from her, he felt a painful tension between his legs. His groin was tight, aching, and he couldn't understand why. Jane was beautiful, yes, but he had other stunning women at his disposal, women who would do anything to be in his bed. As he struggled to free himself from her hold, she reluctantly released his hand and turned her back to him. A pang of pity, sharp and unexpected, struck him. It seemed like she wasn't playing a game this time. The woman before him genuinely seemed to want him, craved him. Making room for her in the bed was perhaps one of the biggest mistakes he had ever made. Immediately after leaning in and feeling her body again against his, all of his resolve crumbled, and the self-control he had meticulously built up over the years vanished without a trace. Jane shivered with desire as he stroked her body, the same body he had gotten lost in the first time. He was tempted, desperately tempted, to make love to her, to forget everything else in the world. "Jane, are you sure you want this?" he asked, knowing it was a foolish question the moment he spoke it. Jane's response was clear. She moved closer to him, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck. John buried his head between her breasts, breathing in her familiar scent, a scent that both haunted and comforted him. This was no coincidence. Jane was indeed the woman who had saved him from a brutal man the same day he had his accident. Regret, bitter and overwhelming, suddenly washed over him. He had mistreated this woman, hurt her in countless ways all this time, even though she deserved none of the ill treatment he had inflicted upon her. He paused, pulling back slightly to look into her eyes. "Do you remember the night you were almost assaulted by a man a few years ago?" he asked softly. Jane nodded slowly, her eyes widening with understanding. And then, a sudden realization hit her. "It was you. You're the one who saved me." John nodded, his expression filled with a mixture of pain and remorse. He enveloped her in a tight embrace. "Jane, I'm sorry for everything I put you through. Will you ever forgive me?" Jane smiled at him, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. "I've already forgiven you. Otherwise, I would never have offered you something so precious to me." John looked at her, suddenly speechless. He was surprised, floored, when he realized that Jane had never experienced anything this intimate before. She blushed, lowering her face shyly, and then nodded. She smelled like heaven, and John was almost tempted to undress her in that moment and take her without restraint. "Are you sure you really want me to do this?" he asked again, seeking final confirmation, as much for his own sake as for hers. Jane only smiled in response, encouraging him to continue exploring her body. John got up from the bed, and she let out a small sound of disagreement, a tiny whimper of longing. "Calm down," he said reassuringly, trying to find a way to protect both of them. Jane rolled her eyes, looking at him with unconcealed desire. He took a condom from his back pocket and quickly put it on. He watched her eyes widen in surprise at his size, a look he was more than used to. He slid back into the bed, kissed her passionately, and began working his magic on her breasts. Jane arched her back as he moved away from her lips to feast on the tender flesh of her chest. Her soft moans encouraged him to continue. John quickly removed the last piece of fabric covering her skin, leaving her naked before him. Her breathing became erratic, shallow gasps. Jane noticed his gaze and smiled joyfully. Why are you so shocked? You said you'd seen plenty of naked women before," she teased, her voice a breathless whisper. John couldn't admit that it was a lie. He had slept with many women, yes, but none of them had ever made him feel like this raw, this exposed, this vulnerable. In that moment, a wave of possessive jealousy washed over him at the thought of another man seeing her in this splendor, of another man having known her before him. "I want to be your last," he murmured, drawing his face closer to her thigh. Jane tightened her thighs, almost denying him access, but he quickly won the battle, gently parting her legs. When his tongue touched her clitoris, she jolted violently, overwhelmed by a fresh wave of pleasure so intense it bordered on pain. Stop torturing me," she begged, her voice trembling. "Not yet, darling," he responded softly, covering her body with kisses, each one more deliberate, more intoxicating than the last. Her cries of pleasure and soft moans rewarded him for his exploration. John did everything he could to stop himself from taking her like an animal in heat. She seemed so fragile, so innocent, and he didn't want to hurt her, not in any way. He wanted to take his time, to savor every moment. It was her first time, and he wanted this moment to be unforgettable for her. After finishing with his tongue, he slowly slid a finger into her opening. She climbed in pain before another wave of pleasure overtook her, and she arched her back to welcome a second finger. Jane gasped, her eyes closed, lost in the swirling vortex of sensation. John watched her reach climax under his fingers before positioning himself over her, placing his manhood at the entrance of her body. As soon as the tip touched her, she arched toward him, her body a silent invitation, and took him in entirely. He had planned to take his time, to be gentle and considerate, but her body seemed eager to be fulfilled, to be completely and utterly possessed. He grabbed her waist to stabilize her as he pushed deeper, inching his way further into her warmth. Her eyes were closed, and she gritted her teeth, a look he found very seductive. He wanted to increase the pace, to lose himself in the rhythm of their bodies, but he wasn't sure if she was ready, not until she asked him to go faster, her voice laced with desperation. John changed position, kneeling on one knee before taking her from behind. As she screamed in pleasure, he muffled her cries with his hand, aware that the walls weren't soundproof, and the last thing he wanted was to alert the entire building to their activities. "Take it slow," he murmured gently, placing his hand over her mouth to stifle her sounds. John lightly spanked her, and she gasped loudly as she reached orgasm, her body convulsing in a series of delicious shudders. She turned around and climbed on top of him, surprising him with her sudden boldness. "Are you sure you want another round?" he asked, a playful smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Of course," she replied, her eyes gleaming with mischief, playfully nipping at his nipple. John smiled at her innocence, mocking her slightly. "The way you mounted me made me think you were a pro," he teased, his voice husky with desire. Jane blushed deeply and looked away, suddenly self-conscious. John resumed his gentle movements, guiding her as she quickly learned to find her rhythm. She moved slowly at first, then increased her pace, whimpering and twisting her body seductively. She was a quick learner, adaptable and eager to please. When she grew tired, she gently collapsed on his body, her limbs heavy and relaxed. John chuckled softly before lifting her and carrying her to the bathroom for a shower. After lifting Jane and carrying her into the bathroom, John carefully placed her under the hot water. They bathed together in comfortable silence, the gentle spray washing away the traces of their passion. Jane, visibly shy and hesitant, asked softly, "What do you think?" John looked at her with an amused smile. He couldn't help but find her adorable in her awkwardness, especially after what they had just shared. She tried to cover her breast with her hands, but John burst into laughter, teasing her gently. "What exactly are you covering? You weren't this shy a few minutes ago," he remarked, his eyes dancing with mischief. Jane blushed immediately at his words, and the thought of her audacity, her uninhibited surrender, made her smile despite herself. She sat facing him, trying to hide her embarrassment. John looked at her with newfound tenderness, appreciating her naivety and innocence, even after everything they had just experienced. "Tell me, was it my father who made you change your mind about me, or did it come from you?" John asked, curious about what had suddenly made her so close to him, what had sparked this sudden shift in her affections. Jane bit her lip, hesitant to reveal her true feelings, but finally answered with a mischievous smile. "From the first day I laid eyes on you, unconscious in that room, I felt something for you," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. John blinked, surprised by her confession, the unexpected honesty of her words. He sank slowly into the water, his eyes never leaving Jane's. "So, are you going to stand there all day asking questions? Or are you going to join me?" he invited, making space for her in the bathtub. The offer was tempting, impossible to resist, and Jane hesitated for only a moment before sliding into the hot water next to him. The warmth of the water running down her bare skin, combined with John's intense gaze on her, made her heart beat faster. He rested his head on John's shoulder as his left hand gently explored Jane's body, caressing her skin with growing familiarity, mapping the landscape of her curves and contours. Jane suddenly felt overwhelmed by a new kind of pleasure, a soft, painful tension that engulfed her as John's touches became bolder, more confident, more possessive. It was as if he knew every corner of her body, as if he had always possessed her, as if she had been created solely for him. At some point, he pulled away from her embrace and plunged his head underwater, causing ripples on the surface of the water. Jane watched him with curiosity, unsure of what he was doing. She had thought they were merely there to bathe, to cleanse themselves of the lingering traces of their passion. But John's intention was entirely different, far more carnal. Underwater, he dove into her intimacy, his tongue a flickering flame, and began licking her with an expertise that sent waves of pleasure crashing through her, each one more intense than the last. She tried to suppress a cry of satisfaction, struggling to close her legs, but John easily won the battle by lifting her legs, gaining complete access to her body. Jane twisted beneath him, her hands gripping John's head as he continued his intimate caresses. She felt each movement of his tongue like a wave of heat spreading through her entire body, igniting every nerve ending. When John finally surfaced, spitting out water, his eyes were slightly red from the time spent underwater. Jane let out a sigh of relief, the water running down her skin as the marks of John's lips remained visible on her, a testament to his thoroughness, his passion. That night, Jane slept better than she had in a long time, perhaps ever. John's arms were wrapped tightly around her as if afraid she might slip away, vanish into the darkness. She felt safe, secure, enveloped in the warmth of his embrace. She knew she was supposed to be angry with him, to hold a grudge for everything he had put her through, for the countless ways he had hurt her, but that anger seemed to have vanished, replaced by a burgeoning sense of hope, of possibility. Seeing him sleep peacefully beside her made her realize just how deeply attached she had grown to him, despite everything, despite the pain, despite the lies. John shifted slightly in his sleep and opened his eyes, looking at her as if he hadn't expected her to already be awake. "Good morning, darling," he murmured with a slight smile, his voice still thick with sleep. Jane tried to pull away from him, still sensitive from the pains of the previous night, her muscles aching from their passionate encounter. John noticed her attempt to move away and teased her gently, grabbing her arm and pulling her back against him, his grip surprisingly firm. "You're not trying to starve your husband, are you?" he joked with a laugh, his eyes sparkling with amusement. "Shouldn't you be tired?" she asked, laughing as well, pushing against his chest with her palms. He pretended to pull her closer, his eyes darkening with desire, but she pinched him playfully on the cheek before jumping out of bed, determined to escape his clutches. Of course, he was faster than her, more agile, and before she could even touch the floor, he grabbed her and brought her back to bed, pinning her beneath his body. "John, my body is still sore," she murmured, wriggling under him, attempting to break free from his hold. John looked at her before bursting into laughter, his chest shaking with amusement. "What were you thinking?" he asked, tracing lines on her lips with his fingers, his touch feather-light. "It wouldn't be good for the baby," she stammered, slightly embarrassed, her cheeks flushed with color. John laughed even harder, finding her naivety utterly endearing. "Don't worry, our little girl would appreciate the warmth coming from her father," he teased confidently, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Jane smiled despite herself, amused by her husband's unwavering confidence, his absolute certainty that they were having a daughter. "So what's it going to be?" John asked, looking at her with tenderness, his expression softening. "Let me go," she pleaded softly, hoping he would give in, release her from his grasp, before she could say another word, before she was tempted to surrender completely, before she could utter another plea. John tilted his head toward her and captured her lips in a passionate kiss, a kiss that stole her breath away and sent shivers down her spine. This time, it wasn't a demanding kiss, not a forceful assertion of his dominance, but a soft, tender one, filled with a tenderness that melted her resolve. His lips seemed to fit perfectly with hers, a perfect interlocking of souls, and Jane felt a wave of desire surge through her, a burning need that threatened to consume her. She wanted more, craved more, suddenly finding herself giving in to the heat rising within her, her body responding to every kiss, every touch, with a fervor that surprised even herself. Suddenly, John broke the kiss, a playful smile spreading across his lips. "You're not asking me to let you go anymore," he murmured, teasing her once again, his eyes filled with knowing amusement. This time, it was Jane's turn to get angry, to feel the sting of his playful mockery. She pushed him away forcefully and rolled out of bed, determined to escape his seductive pull, secretly hoping he would come after her, unable to resist the temptation. But he didn't. They were having breakfast when Jane suddenly received a call from the hospital. The doctor informed her that her brother wanted to see her, that he had specifically requested her presence. She quickly got up from the table, leaving her plate half full, the food untouched, and rushed to get dressed, her mind racing with unanswered questions. She hadn't even bothered to tell John about the call. But as she made her way downstairs, she caught his worried gaze, his eyes filled with concern. "Did you plan on going to see your brother without me?" he asked, fixing his eyes on her, his voice betraying a hint of hurt. "Aren't you supposed to be at the office this morning?" she replied, trying to avoid his questions, unwilling to delve into the complexities of their relationship, the fragile peace they had managed to achieve. Instead of answering, John got up from his chair and followed her to the door, his presence a silent, unwavering force. "I'll drive you," he said calmly but firmly, his tone brooking no argument. During the drive to the hospital, Jane tried to engage him in conversation, to break the suffocating silence that hung between them, but John ignored her almost entirely, turning away each time their eyes met, as if afraid to look at her directly, as if he couldn't bear to see the questions, the doubts that lingered in her eyes. The silent treatment was already killing her inside, each moment of estrangement a tiny stab of pain. When they finally arrived at the hospital, she decided not to leave the car until she got a response from him, until he acknowledged her presence, until he broke through the wall of silence he had erected between them. "John, I'm sorry," she began, cupping his cheeks in her hands, hoping for a reaction, searching for a flicker of emotion in his impassive face. John finally looked at her and smiled softly, a genuine, heartfelt smile that made her heart skip a beat. "Say it again," he murmured, almost laughing, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Say what?" she asked, confused by his cryptic request. "Call me darling," he replied, teasing her as he leaned in closer, his breath warm against her skin. Jane smiled despite herself, a quick, sincere smile that revealed the depth of her affection for him. "You're so cheap," she joked, making fun of him, his easy sentimentality. John leaned toward her, hooking his hand around her back, his lips just inches from hers, the air crackling with unspoken desire. "Oh, really?" he murmured, his body almost fully leaning over hers, his weight pressing her back against the seat. Jane shivered with desire, her hands wrapping around his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair. But instead of kissing her, as she had so desperately hoped, he gazed deeply into her eyes, his expression serious, before softly whispering, "We're both shameless people." Blushing with embarrassment, Jane gently pushed him away, trying to compose herself, to regain her composure, before she completely succumbed to his seductive charms. When they arrived at the hospital, Jane noticed Liam sitting on his bed, looking pale and weak. But before she could say a word, before she could even greet him, he rushed toward John and hugged him enthusiastically, his face lighting up with genuine joy. She stood there frozen, not understanding why her brother, whom she hadn't seen in days, was ignoring her, the sister who had sacrificed everything for him, to greet John with such enthusiasm, such overwhelming affection. Liam clung to John's hand, barely giving her a glance, which left Jane even more confused, her mind reeling with unanswered questions. She looked back and forth between her brother and John, who were completely engrossed in their own conversation, as if she didn't exist, as if she were invisible. John noticed her discomfort, her bewilderment, and motioned for her to come closer, his eyes filled with a mixture of apology and understanding. Jane made her way toward them, her face betraying her confusion, her growing sense of frustration. "Can someone tell me what's going on here before I lose my patience?" she barked, unable to contain her frustration any longer. John detached himself from Liam and placed a reassuring hand on Jane's shoulder, his touch a grounding force. "I guess I owe you an explanation," he began in a calm tone, his voice steady and measured. "After the day I ran into you at the hospital, I wanted to learn more about Liam's condition and understand why he wasn't receiving the care he needed, why he was languishing in that sterile, impersonal environment. He took a deep breath before continuing, his eyes filled with sincerity. At first, I thought you were trying to sell your shares to run off with another man, that you were betraying the family, but when I found out you were doing it to cover your brother's hospital bills, to ensure he received the best possible treatment, I decided to pay the bill myself to alleviate your burden. He paused, his voice softening. I asked the doctor not to tell you, to keep my involvement a secret, because I didn't want you to feel indebted to me, because I knew you would refuse my help if you knew the truth. Since that day, I've been visiting Liam 3 times a day to make sure he's doing well, to provide him with companionship, to lift his spirits. He let out a light sigh before adding, Please don't be mad at him for not telling you the truth. It was my idea to keep it a secret because I wanted to protect you, because I wanted to do something good for once, without expecting anything in return. Jane stood speechless, her heart heavy with confusion and gratitude. A complex mixture of emotions she couldn't quite unravel. She had always believed John was ruthless, incapable of showing the slightest bit of love or emotion. A cold, calculating businessman who cared only about money and power. And yet, he had cared for Liam, watching over her brother attentively, providing him with the support and care she couldn't afford. Tears began to stream down her cheeks, blurring her vision, as Liam rushed toward her, wrapping his arms around her in a tight embrace. Uncle John told me you're expecting a little girl, he said, his voice filled with excitement. He said I could be her big brother, he said, his eyes shining with hope. At those words, Jane smiled through her tears and wrapped her arms around the 2 men who had suddenly transformed her life, who had shown her the true meaning of love and sacrifice. She didn't know how to express all the gratitude and love she felt in that moment, the overwhelming sense of connection she had never experienced before. A few months later, Jane was in her room nursing their daughter, Amanda, her face glowing with maternal love. Her husband, John, suddenly entered the room with a frown on his face, his brow furrowed in concern. Is it normal to be jealous of your own baby? He asked, a mix of amusement and worry in his voice, his eyes searching hers for reassurance. Jane looked up, confused by his unexpected question, unsure of where he was going with this. With a mischievous glint in his eye, John responded, You haven't given me a single second since Amanda was born, your entire world revolving around that tiny human, leaving me feeling like an unwanted guest in my own home. Jane had expected him to be joking, to be teasing her as he so often did, but when she looked closer, she noticed that his smile had been replaced by a slight frown, a hint of genuine sadness in his eyes. He seemed genuinely upset, genuinely neglected, his feelings hurt by her perceived indifference. She carefully placed the baby in her crib, ensuring she was comfortable and secure, and approached him, her heart filled with tenderness. John stood leaning against the wall, looking like a child who had been rejected, his posture slumped, his eyes downcast. As Jane drew near, a smile spread across his lips, a slow, seductive smile that promised untold pleasures, and he immediately scooped her up, as if he couldn't resist her proximity, placing her on his lap. He captured her lips in a passionate kiss, as if he couldn't wait any longer to reconnect with her intimately, to erase the distance that had grown between them. She responded with equal fervor, her body arching into his, realizing that she too had missed their closeness, that the absence of his touch had left a void in her life. She wasn't the only one who had felt the distance, the subtle shift in their dynamic, the unspoken longing for connection. The end. I hope you enjoyed the story of Jane and John. If you did, you'll love this new story you see on your screen. It's 100 times more interesting and emotional than Jane and John's. Click on the video, and we'll meet you there. Don't forget, we love you.